I'm requesting the Indonesian government representative persons at this forum to facilitate political negotiation with the national government of West Papua, led by Simon Sapioper, and the National Liberation Army, commanded by Puro Okimowenda.
In closing, we have a question to the panelists.
Friends, welcome to the Manuscript Papua YouTube channel. Hi everyone, thank you for joining us here at Manuscript Papua. Pada tanggal 15 Juli 2025, telah dilaksanakan pertemuan ketiga dalam rangkaian sesi ke-18 Mekanisme Ahli tentang Hak-Hak Masyarakat Adat, Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, EMRIP, yang bertempat di Jenewa. Agenda utama pada pertemuan tersebut adalah diskusi panel yang membahas peran strategis lembaga hak asasi manusia di tingkat nasional dan regional dalam mendukung dan mewujudkan tujuan-tujuan yang terkandung dalam Deklarasi Perserikatan Bangsa-Bangsa tentang Hak-Hak Masyarakat Adat. Diskusi ini menyoroti bagaimana lembaga-lembaga tersebut dapat menjadi motor penggerak dalam pengawasan, advokasi, serta pelaksanaan kebijakan yang memastikan perlindungan hak-hak masyarakat adat sesuai dengan prinsip-prinsip yang telah disepakati secara internasional. Selain itu, diskusi ini juga mengangkat pentingnya kolaborasi antara lembaga nasional, regional, dan mekanisme internasional dalam memperkuat pelaksanaan deklarasi tersebut di berbagai tingkat pemerintahan. Hasil dari diskusi panel ini diharapkan dapat memberikan rekomendasi yang konkret dan strategis guna meningkatkan peran lembaga hak asasi manusia dalam melindungi dan mempromosikan hak-hak masyarakat adat secara efektif dan berkelanjutan. Yang membuat pusing bangsa Indonesia dalam forum ini adalah soal Papua. Dalam forum tersebut, Presiden NHRWP, Tuan Simon Petrus Sapioper, telah membacakan pernyataan politik yang mewakili suara Papua untuk perundingan dengan pemerintah Indonesia. Hal ini menimbulkan ketegangan dan perhatian khusus, terutama dari pihak pemerintah Indonesia, karena menyangkut isu kedaulatan dan integritas wilayah. Pertanyaannya, apa yang salah dengan Indonesia? Secara umum, pertanyaan ini biasanya merujuk pada kritik internasional terhadap beberapa hal berikut terkait penanganan pemerintah Indonesia terhadap Papua. 1. Hak asasi manusia. Ada kekhawatiran dan laporan soal dugaan pelanggaran HAM di Papua, termasuk tindakan kekerasan, pembatasan kebebasan berekspresi dan berorganisasi bagi masyarakat adat Papua. 2. Hak masyarakat adat. Indonesia dianggap kurang memberi pengakuan dan perlindungan penuh terhadap hak-hak masyarakat adat Papua, termasuk soal pengelolaan sumber daya alam dan partisipasi politik. 3. Proses dialog dan penyelesaian konflik. Kritik muncul terkait minimnya dialog yang konstruktif antara pemerintah pusat dengan masyarakat adat Papua dan kelompok pro-kemerdekaan, yang menyebabkan ketegangan berkepanjangan. 4. Status politik Papua. Ada perbedaan pandangan antara pemerintah Indonesia yang menganggap Papua sebagai bagian tak terpisahkan dari NKRI, dengan kelompok seperti NJRWP, yang menginginkan pengakuan kemerdekaan, atau setidaknya status otonomi khusus yang lebih luas atau merdeka. Intinya, persoalan yang salah dengan Indonesia menurut pandangan kelompok seperti NJRWP dan mungkin pengamat internasional adalah bagaimana Indonesia menangani isu Papua yang melibatkan hak-hak masyarakat adat, kebebasan politik, dan penghormatan atas aspirasi rakyat Papua. Namun, dari sisi pemerintah Indonesia, persoalan ini sering dianggap sebagai urusan internal yang harus dijaga keutuhan dan kedaulatannya. Friends, don't forget to leave a positive comment. Warm greetings from Manuscript Papua, a YouTube channel that shares stories from West Papua.
Manuscript Papua.
Get ready for the count. 3, 2, 1.
I now give the floor to Indonesia. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Indonesia welcomes this timely panel discussion. We recognize the important role of national human rights institutions, including our own National Human Rights Commission, or Komnas HAM, in promoting and protecting the rights of marginalized and vulnerable groups. Moreover, Indonesia values regional mechanisms that emphasize dialogue, mutual respect, and constructive cooperation as exemplified within ASEAN frameworks. Mr. Chair, in our national context, Indonesia affirms the right of masyarakat adat or adat communities, which are enshrined in our constitution and embedded within our legal and institutional system. Our national human rights institution, Komnas HAM, has worked closely with stakeholders to address the rights of these communities through complaints handling, monitoring efforts, and policy advocacy. Within our vibrant civil society landscape, the government sees that civil society organizations and Komnas HAM play a vital role in amplifying the voices of adat communities, particularly in the realization of their rights. Recently, Komnas HAM launched a normative standards and guidelines on the protections of the rights of masyarakat adat. This document provides a national framework to guide all stakeholders in promoting the respect, protection, fulfillment, and restoration of Adat communities' rights consistent with universal human rights principles and our Constitution. Mr. Chair, Indonesia believes that context-sensitive approaches are essential. Each country must be granted the space to interpret and implement indigenous rights according to its legal, historical, and cultural realities. Our Adat communities are custodians of traditional knowledge, local wisdom, and sustainable natural resource management. Their contributions are integral to our collective development. In closing, we have a question to the panelists. In the context of diverse legal system across ASEAN, how can we ensure that regional cooperation does not lead to normative homogenization, but instead strengthen human rights protection that is responsive to each state's cultural, historical, and legal particularities? I thank you.
So now I would like to give the floor to National Papua Verining, West New Guinea.
Oh, yes, thanks, yes. Yeah.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson and respected delegating. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here in the forum. I am attend this forum as a representative of the indigenous people of the eastern Indonesia, namely the province of Central Papua in the mountains region. In the particular, I represented the Papuan minority who have been politically opposite to the government. The conflict in the mountain region is still ongoing. And this is a matter of great concern to the Indonesian government. This politically motivated conflict has result in numerous consolidated amongst the indigenous Papuans people and non-Papuans residents. To address this political conflict and violence, I'm requesting the Indonesian government representative persons at this forum to facilitate political negotiation with the national government of West Papua led by Simon Sapioper and the National Liberation Army commanded by Puro Okimbawenda. Because the region led by Commander Puro Okimbawenda has unilateral declared the Lanijaya region in Central Papua in the mountain to be outside the geographic territory of the sovereign states of the Republic of Indonesia. And indigenous people of Lani have long recognized the national government of Republic of West Papua as the governing authority of the region. Therefore, I propose the following in this forum. I emphasize that we are willing to negotiate with Indonesian government, and we urge the representative of the Indonesian government to take this matter seriously and contact us. I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. Good morning, everyone. May I ask those of you still standing to take your seats so that we start our meeting on time. Thank you. On behalf of the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous People, I warmly welcome all esteemed panelists and participants, including Indigenous peoples representatives, member states, national human rights institutions and regional human rights bodies, NGOs, academic institutions, OECHR, Indigenous fellows and guarantees, and others. It is my pleasure to chair this session on discussing the role of national human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the declaration. This agenda item is the very testimony of recognizing the pivotal role the national and regional human rights institutions play in bridging international human rights standards with practical realities on the ground. These institutions are not only monitors and advocates, but they are facilitators of dialogue, enablers of participation, and defenders of indigenous people's rights. EMRIP's amended mandate through the Human Rights Council Resolution 3325 in 2016 further emphasizes on this role and need for an enhanced engagement with national and regional human rights bodies. The central aim of today's panel discussion is therefore to identify areas for strengthening collaboration between national human rights institutions which are compliant with the Paris Principles, the regional human rights bodies, and the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples. It will provide an opportunity to exchange good practices and challenges relating to their work at country-level engagement with indigenous peoples' rights with the following objectives. First, to assess the key role played by national human rights institutions in promoting legal and policy reform nationally, aiming at effective implementation of the Declaration. Discuss their central role in furthering the effective participation of indigenous peoples in decision-making processes on issues that affect them. Explore strategies and sharing good practices on how to engage effectively with indigenous human rights mechanisms, human rights treaty bodies, and the Universal Periodic Review, particularly on using the Declaration as a tool for interpreting states' obligations under international human rights law. Assessing good practices adopted by NHRIs and regional human rights bodies in monitoring, reporting on the implementation of the rights of indigenous peoples, especially on their key role in adopting anti-discrimination measures as per Article 15C of the Declaration. Explore successful instances of collaborative efforts between them and indigenous peoples at national level, and also assess the potential for future expansion and strengthening of such partnerships. It will also explore the challenges and barriers in effective implementation of the Declaration and indigenous peoples' effective participation, with emphasis on discussing and identifying the structural and institutional barriers nationally that hinder such meaningful participation. I would like to invite our speakers to share concrete examples of how national human rights institutions have successfully collaborated with indigenous peoples at national level. Let's also explore together how these partnerships can be further strengthened and expanded to drive broader and lasting change. Furthermore, we call upon them to reflect, discuss how such initiatives have promoted indigenous peoples' participation in shaping policies, advocating for rights, and ensuring accountability at national and regional levels, giving primacy to the voices of indigenous peoples. As we move forward, I encourage our panel to propose actionable recommendations that can help promote the wider adoption of effective practices. Let's also address the key barriers identified during our discussions, with the aim of advancing the implementation of the Declaration in meaningful and practical ways. Today, we have 5 distinguished speakers with us, each bringing a wealth of experience, knowledge, and insights into this important discussion. We are honored that you've accepted our invitation and taken the time to join us today, and I want to thank you and give you a warm welcome once again. It's my pleasure now to invite Mr. Andres Einar Broderstad to take the floor as the representative of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions Indigenous Peoples Caucus. Just to say a few words about the caucus. It was established in October 2024 and co-convened by the Norwegian National Human Rights Institution. It brings together 22 national human rights institutions committed to advancing indigenous peoples' rights through peer exchange, advocacy, and capacity building, ensuring indigenous rights remain central to GANHRI's work and the global human rights agenda. Mr. Broderstad is a lawyer and advisor at the Norwegian Human Rights Institution. He has previously served as the deputy judge in the district court and as an advisor in the Norwegian Customs Directorate and the Police Directorate. His current focus includes, among others, indigenous rights, freedom of expression, the right to privacy, and freedom of religion. Mr. Broderstad, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
Distinguished colleagues and participants, it's an honor to join you today on behalf of the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions, GANHRI. We thank the expert mechanism for the invitation to contribute to this important discussion. GANHRI is the international network of national human rights institutions, NHRIs. Last year, GANHRI established a caucus on indigenous peoples' rights, a new initiative supporting collaboration among NHRIs in this area. At the outset, the NHRIs are independent public bodies with a broad mandate to protect and promote human rights in their countries. Some NHRIs operate as ombudsmen or commissions, which can consider human rights complaints in individual cases, while other NHRIs work with human rights at a systemic level only. And some are hybrid institutions. NHRIs are uniquely placed to promote the implementation of UNDRIP within their states, and there are undoubtedly many measures that could strengthen the implementation of UNDRIP, but it's not our intention here to provide an exhaustive review of all potential actions. But to start, ensuring that the structure and work of the NHRI itself is in line with UNDRIP is a fundamental step. This includes that NHRIs are accessible to indigenous peoples, reflects indigenous perspectives in their own operations, and uphold high standards for consultation and participation. For example, the Norwegian NHRI has established a permanent office in Govdegano, in the heart of Sami territory, to ensure a visible and consistent presence in indigenous areas. There are also Sami representatives on the Norwegian NHRI's board and advisory committee. The Australian Human Rights Commission has a dedicated commissioner mandated to monitor and promote indigenous rights and provide reports to the government. The Danish NHRI has established a permanent office in Nuuk, Kalaallit, Nunat, Greenland, and has a very close collaboration with the Human Rights Council of Greenland. The Danish NHRI also has a board member appointed by the Human Rights Council of Greenland. This is just some examples, and this can be said of many NHRIs. Assessing national laws, policies, and practices against the standard of UNDRIP is another key role of the NHRIs. Through monitoring, reporting, and formal advice, NHRIs can help ensure that domestic frameworks align with the declaration. The Finnish NHRI has continuously stressed the importance of and respect for self-determination of the Sami and the process of FPIC when the recently renewed Sami Parliament Act was drafted. The Australian NHRI has adopted a principled approach to implementation of the UNDRIP, identifying 4 core principles which underlies the 46 articles, and then using these as the thematic focus areas to guide advocacy and assessment of laws and policies. NHRIs have also played a crucial role in advocating for UNDRIP to be incorporated into domestic legislation, as well as national implementation plans and strategies. NHRIs have an important role in promoting the visibility of indigenous peoples in national statistics and appropriate governance of indigenous data. The Danish Institute for Human Rights has partnered with indigenous organizations to develop and promote the Indigenous Navigator, a tool for community-led data collection grounded in UNDRIP. The Danish Institute has also supported efforts to foster dialogue and collaboration between indigenous people, national statistical offices, and national human rights institutions, helping to bridge citizen-generated data with official statistics and to promote more inclusive and representative data systems. Defending indigenous rights when they are threatened by specific developments or projects is an essential function of NHRIs. In Honduras, the NHRI intervened when an emergency detention center was planned on indigenous land without free, prior, and informed consent of local indigenous communities. It supported peaceful protests, conducted site inspection, and formally warned the government of the potential human rights violation. Similarly, in Norway, the NHRI criticized delays in implementing a Supreme Court judgment concerning wind power developments in Sami areas, provided advice to the parties in the subsequent mediation processes. NHRIs can provide a platform for indigenous people to effectively participate in decision-making processes which affect them. Several NHRIs have encouraged states and corporations to engage in meaningful processes and dialogue with indigenous peoples prior to decision-making. In the Philippines, the NHRIs has conducted dialogues and monitoring with indigenous communities affected by both natural and human-made hazards in central and southern Philippines, with the aim of documenting their experience for policy recommendations and reform. NHRIs also participate in international forums and follow up on the implementation of recommendations. Given the special standing of NHRIs within the UN system and the access many NHRIs have to the government, NHRIs often act as a bridge builder between domestic and global accountability efforts. NHRIs regularly make submissions concerning indigenous rights to UN treaty bodies, special rapporteurs, the Permanent Forum, and EMRIP, and help ensure that observations and guidance from these bodies are taken seriously by governments. We have observed instances where states disregarded recommendations and measures proposed by international monitoring mechanism. As a result, little to no progress is made in improving the situation. In this context, NHRI play a vital role in promoting these recommendations, ensuring that they are recognized and understood within their countries. NHRIs can serve as a vital partner in implementing these recommendations. Finally, raising awareness about UNDRIP within state authorities, among indigenous communities, and across the general public is an ongoing responsibility. This includes clarifying the legal and political significance of the declaration and countering misconception that it grants special privileges or rights to indigenous peoples that others do not enjoy. Indigenous issues often rank low on the political agenda, but NHRI can use their institutional weight to shine a spotlight on indigenous issues. Awareness raising may take form of community dialogue, public campaigns, media engagement, or educational materials. In all of these efforts, NHRIs plays a unique role as an independent institutions with a mandate to promote human rights for all, including indigenous peoples. Thank you. Gitu.
I thank you, Mr. Broderstan, for your statement. May I ask the next speakers, please, to speak slowly to enable the translators to translate your statements. I would now like to give the floor to Madam Hawe Haman Buba, who is a commissioner at the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. Madam Buba is an expert in human rights and humanitarian action. She is also an expert member of the Working Group of Indigenous Populations and Minorities of the African Commission on Human and People's Rights. Madam Buba, you have 7 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. I want to thank EMRIP for instituting this panel, for instituting the panel on the National Human Rights Institution. I think for some years now we have been participating, few national human rights institutions have been participating in EMRIP for the last 3 years. And I realized that EMRIP recognized their presence and decided to organize this panel. So I'm grateful for that. At least the NHRIs can contribute to human rights, to the indigenous people's rights, advancing the UN Declaration on the rights of indigenous people. I will talk about the role that our institution is playing for the implementation of the UNDRIP. The Cameroon Human Rights Commission is an independent institution with a broad mandate of promotion, protection of human rights, and it also serves as the national mechanism for the prevention of torture. It is established by law, voted by the parliament. The institution has gone through several reforms from 1992 when it was a committee, and it went through a reform in 2004 established by a law to become the National Commission for Human Rights and Freedom. And in July 2019, it went again through another reform to align it with the Paris Principles to become the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. It works through 3 mechanisms: the mechanism for protection, promotion, and prevention of torture. It also works through thematics, and one of the thematics is the rights of indigenous people. And also, this thematic has a focal point, who is an indigenous person. I'm the one here, sitting here, and our role is to monitor indigenous people's human rights situations in Cameroon. We monitor this situation through focal persons from indigenous organizations in the different regions. The Commission has regional branches in the 10 regions of the country, and one divisional office in one of the divisions that has a lot of ethnic conflicts. So we build the capacity and support the work of indigenous organizations through technical and financial support. We participate in the activities to give them more visibility, and we also permit them to participate in almost all the activities of the Cameroon Human Rights Commission. We commemorate the International Day of World Indigenous People and issue a statement with strong recommendations to different stakeholders, such as like the government, the UN system, civil society organizations, and also indigenous organizations. And the Commission can be seized by indigenous people's organizations or any witnesses of human rights violations happening in these communities verbally by writing or through its free tool number 1523. And this matter will be investigated and prosecuted if the allegations are founded. Many cases since 2021 have been resolved in the East and Adamawa regions of Cameroon, where we had cases of murder, harassment, arbitrary arrest, seizure of properties, issues of land and resources, and domination of indigenous people by other communities. Such issues where the Commission resolved them in a very favorable manner for indigenous people. The Commission is an advisory body to the government on human rights issues. We also monitor and evaluate the government's international human rights obligation by carrying out, for example, the consultation with the civil society to make inputs to its universal periodic report and also present a shadow report when the country was examined in 2023. The Commission received the recommendations and carried out a review and made propositions to the government on pertinent recommendations, such as those pertaining to ratification of human rights instruments. Out of the 220 recommendations accepted, 8 were in favor of indigenous people, and these recommendations were shared to the various stakeholders for implementation. Since this year, we have been strengthening the capacity of civil society organizations with the support of the UN Center for Human Rights and Democracy, which is an organ of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, to monitor, to train them how to monitor and the implementation of the recommendations of the UPR. The process is still ongoing. The Commission also has a role to, I've already said it, to evaluate government action in fulfilling its international human rights obligation. And since the adoption of the UNDRIP in 2007, the government has made some strides towards its implementation. In 2008, the Prime Minister, head of government, passed a decree to make official the commemoration of the International Day of World Indigenous People, and by so doing recognizes their existence. Indigenous issues are under an institution, a ministerial department, the Ministry of Social Affairs, the Directorate of National Solidarity. The ministry has 2 programs, the Interministerial Committee, which supervises programs and actions in favor of indigenous people. This committee meets during the week of the celebration of the International Day of Indigenous People to evaluate the actions, projects, and programs that have been realized during the past year for indigenous, in favor of indigenous people. The government department also have the National Plan for the Development of Indigenous People, which is also a very broad plan with several axes, major axes on rights to land and resources, social and economic rights, civil and political rights. It is, they are encouraging international organizations, civil society organizations that intervene in indigenous questions, and the indigenous people's organization to work respecting, the plan and working in those very important axes. We also, the Ministry of Wildlife and Forests has also signed a memorandum of understanding with an indigenous organization in the East region to give access to the backup communities, access to carry out their traditional activities in 4 major parks in the East region, including the Lobeke National Park, and quotas also in the School of the Forest and Wildlife. They have also a quota in the National Police Training Schools. In terms of participation, indigenous people have mayors, they have councillors in local governments, and also in the regional councils. We have alternate parliamentarians. We don't have a law, specific law on indigenous people, but indigenous people issues are taken care in sectoral texts and strategies. So I think we also work with the UN in implementing the UNDRIP also, because we have the UN Center for Human Rights and Democracy in Central Africa, which gives us capacity building, also help us to train civil society organizations. We also work with civil society. We have 2 major networks of civil society of about 800 civil society organizations, and we work with them. They help us in some of our activities in regions where we are not found, so we collaborate with them. So maybe for now I will end here. I think recommendations was strengthening the legal framework aimed at protecting the right of indigenous people, stronger legal protection measures aimed at holding perpetrators of human rights violations against indigenous people in terms of right to land and resources. And the Commission, for its part, will spare no effort to continue the promotion and protection of human rights and the human rights of indigenous people in particular. Thank you very much.
I thank you, Madam Buba, for your statement. I now give the floor to Mr. Grigory Diyukarev, who is the Commissioner for the Rights of Small Numbers Indigenous Peoples of Krasnoyarsk Territory, Russia Federation. Mr. Diyukarev is a member of the Nenets Indigenous Peoples from the Arctic, and he brings over 25 years of experience in human rights advocacy. Mr. Diyukarev, you have the floor for 7 minutes.
Уважаемый господин председатель, позвольте выразить экспертному механизму признательность за организацию этой панельной дискуссии и внимание к опыту коренных народов России. Мое выступление будет посвящено роли уполномоченных по правам коренных малочисленных народов Российской Федерации. Это дополнительное несудебное средство правовой защиты, позволяющее делать доступ коренных народов к правосудию более эффективным и более приемлемым с культурной точки зрения. Хочу подчеркнуть, данный механизм был создан по инициативе самих коренных народов, в консультациях с ними. Коротко поясню правовой контекст. 69-я статья Конституции России гарантирует права коренных малочисленных народов в соответствии с общепризнанными принципами и нормами международного права. В развитии этой статьи развивается двухуровневое законодательство. Федеральные законы гарантируют минимальные стандарты, а регионы формулируют более детализированные меры поддержки с учетом местной специфики. Институт региональных омбудсменов как раз является примером такого регионального регулирования, которое стало возможным после решений президента страны и развития Института уполномоченного по правам человека в Российской Федерации. В разное время в целях поощрения и защиты прав коренных народов в 5 регионах России, в Красноярском крае, в Республике Саха-Якутия, в Камчатском крае, в Сахалинской области и в Ханты-Мансийском автономном округе учреждены позиции независимых омбудсменов, уполномоченных по правам коренных малочисленных народов. Правозащитный институт в полной мере соответствует парижским принципам, касающимся статуса национальных учреждений, занимающихся поощрением и защитой прав человека. Появление должности уполномоченного по правам коренных малочисленных народов в нашей стране соответствует принципам и духу Декларации ООН о правах коренных народов и непосредственно способствует реализации статей 1, 5, 18, 19, 33, 34, 38 Декларации. Декларация наряду с Конституцией и национальными законами – это мои настольные книги. Хочу поблагодарить экспертный механизм за качественные исследования по многим темам, в том числе о доступе к правосудию. В ряде исследований, которые я представляю, наш институт упоминается в качестве примера положительной практики. Стоит отметить, что уполномоченными по правам коренных малочисленных народов назначены представители именно коренных малочисленных народов. Их выдвижение и назначение осуществляется после проведения консультаций и согласований с представительными органами коренных народов. Уполномоченные, согласно закону, независимы и не подотчетны перед государственными органами власти. Наша главная задача – обеспечение дополнительных гарантий государственной защиты прав и законных интересов коренных народов. В наших полномочиях требовать от органов государственной власти, органов местного самоуправления, высоких должностных лиц соблюдение прав и интересов коренных народов по всем аспектам их жизнедеятельности. В нашей компетенции рассмотрение жалоб и обращений на решения, действия или бездействие органов власти и должностных лиц, проведение проверок по жалобам и обращениям, беспрепятственное посещение государственных и муниципальных учреждений, в том числе тюрем, изоляторов, то есть мест, где содержатся лица, совершившие преступления. Мы мониторим выполнение федерального и регионального законодательства в отношении коренных народов. Вносим предложения о рассмотрении проектов нормативно-правовых актов в законодательные органы. Вносим предложения по разработке долгосрочных политик и стратегий, мер поддержки в отношении коренных народов. Также вносим предложения по совершенствованию государственных программ устойчивого развития коренных народов. Иногда выступаем в суде в защиту прав представителей коренных народов. Таким образом, омбудсмены имеют мандат на практическую правовую помощь лицам, семьям, сообществам коренных народов, а также на участие в исправлении системных ошибок в законодательстве. По большому счету, уполномоченный – это и правозащитник, и медиатор между коренными народами, государством и бизнесом. Я и мои коллеги в других субъектах Российской Федерации постоянно выезжаем в места традиционного проживания коренных народов. Как правило, это оленеводческие стойбища, небольшие стоянки рыбаков, охотников, отдаленные поселки и деревни, расположенные за сотни километров от асфальтовых дорог, аэропортов, речных вокзалов, железнодорожных станций. Мы стремимся добраться до каждого, кто нуждается в нашей правовой помощи. Зачастую нам приходится повышать осведомленность коренных народов об их правах. Закон обязывает нас знакомиться с условиями проживания, быта, хозяйствования коренных малочисленных народов. Мы обязаны вникать в особенности традиционной экономики, культуры, систем образования, здравоохранения, коммунального хозяйства. Мы изучаем социально-демографические условия жизни, вопросы обеспечения пенсионных и трудовых прав, уделяем внимание правам на благоприятную окружающую среду, экологию, биологическое разнообразие. часто выступаем посредниками между коренными народами и бизнес-компаниями. А в случае нарушений прав коренных народов со стороны бизнес-компаний, безусловно, встаем на сторону коренных малочисленных народов. По итогам поездок в места традиционного проживания коренных народов, анализа жалоб и обращений составляется доклад уполномоченного, который представляется депутатом регионального парламента. В докладе приводятся статистические сведения по количеству и тематике обращений, отражаются правозащитные практики, как положительные, так и отрицательные. Даются рекомендации губернатору, председателю правительства, министрам, иным должностным лицам по улучшению качества жизни коренных народов. В докладе отражаются рекомендации по совершенствованию нормативно-правовых актов в области защиты прав коренных народов. В случае нарушения прав я направляю официальные письма и запросы в адрес прокуратуры нашего региона, руководству полиции и иные правоохранительные органы. Это наиболее действенный подход. В некоторых случаях, как я уже говорил, защищаем права в судебных инстанциях. Уполномоченные тесно взаимодействуют с организациями коренных народов, проводят мероприятия по правовому просвещению и содействуют повышению экспертного потенциала коренных народов. На площадках экспертного механизма уже неоднократно упоминался положительный опыт России в части организации и деятельности школы общественной дипломатии для коренных народов. Могу заверить, что уполномоченные частые гости на данной площадке. Федеральные органы власти часто обращаются к уполномоченным за консультациями и экспертными оценками, так как уровень их квалификации очень высокий, а жизненный опыт и знания востребованы и в государственных, и в научных, и в экспертных сообществах. К примеру, я вхожу в состав Общественного совета Федерального министерства по развитию Дальнего Востока и Арктики, а также вхожу в состав экспертно-консультативного совета при Федеральном агентстве по делам национальностей. Это позволяет нам, уполномоченным, отстаивать права коренных народов на высшем государственном уровне. Приведу несколько цифр в завершении своего выступления. В Красноярском крае проживают почти 3 миллиона человек. При этом коренных малочисленных народов всего лишь 16 500. Это примерно 0,5% от общей численности населения. В качестве рекомендаций членам экспертного механизма хотел бы предложить провести тематическое исследование о роли национальных правозащитных институтов и представительных органов коренных народов в поощрении и защите прав коренных народов. Спасибо за внимание.
I thank you, Mr. Dayukari, for your statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Julia Wapoti, Tatau Urutai, Tino Rangatiratanga at New Zealand Human Rights Commission. Ms. Wapoti is a prominent Maori leader and an advocate for Indigenous rights and social justice. She has previously served as a director on the Royal Commission of Inquiry into Historical Abuse in State Care and has worked with the Office of the Children's Commission on Safe and Effective Justice Advisory Group. I now like to give the floor to Ms. Wapoti. You have 7 minutes.
Ko tai mano warurau wha te kau te tau I wai tohunga te tiriti o Waitangi nā te karona nā nai whakairo nā hoki e tūraki e. Tuia te rangi e tū nei, tuia te papa e takato nei, tuia te tapuai o ngā tipuna ki a tātou e hui nei. Tui, 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 tuia, haumi e, hui e, tai ki e. Tēnā tātou katoa. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I acknowledge the Indigenous peoples of this land and from around the world. I am a Ngāti Parau woman from Aotearoa, and I speak on behalf of Te Kāhui Tika Tangata, New Zealand's Human Rights Commission. 1 year ago, I reported the Commission's concerns about the winding back of human rights in Aotearoa. Matters have not improved since, and the New Zealand government continues to undermine Indigenous people's rights and Te Tiriti o Waitangi through a program of law and policy measures. It does so against the warnings of the Waitangi Tribunal, against the advice of its own officials, and against the will of its citizens. Last November saw what was estimated to be New Zealand's largest ever protest in opposition to the government's attempt to redefine Te Tiriti o Waitangi and Indigenous rights. As the NHRI, it is our role to hold every New Zealand government to account, to promote and to protect the international human rights framework, and to ensure that every administration honours the duties it bears to tangata whenua, the Indigenous peoples of New Zealand. The New Zealand government was slow to support the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples under previous administrations, but its commitment to UNDRIP has since been progressed by administrations from both sides of Parliament. We are disappointed that the current government is stepping back from its commitment. Te Kahui Tika Tangata, New Zealand's Human Rights Commission, is an A-status NHRI. In 2027, we will celebrate 50 years as New Zealand's national human rights institution. As NHRIs, it is our role to promote and protect the human rights framework. The Declaration is an integral part of that framework and is absolutely core to our work. NHRIs can act as connectors between the state and citizen and between the national and international human rights systems. Our role is to help our communities connect with, understand and assert their rights. In the New Zealand context, we often do this by highlighting the links between the Declaration and our founding treaty, Te Tiriti o Waitangi. Our former Commissioner, Eri Hapati Murchi, took part in the UN Working Group meetings here in Geneva when the Declaration was being drafted. We still draw on her words to help highlight the value and relevance of the Declaration to our people back home and the other side of the world. We can also help our communities' voices to be heard, using the opportunities that we have as NHRIs at the international level to highlight their concerns. For example, in preparing our shadow report to the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination Committee, we've met with a number of community organisations. We have heard their concerns about New Zealand's regression on Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights and about rising levels of racism experienced by Māori. Our report to the CERD will reflect what we've heard. Increasingly, we need to combat misconceptions about the rights of Indigenous peoples. This is why we rely on international bodies to provide clear statements of what human rights require. We can then use these to remind lawmakers of their obligations. For example, the New Zealand government has a law reform program set on redefining and removing legal and constitutional recognition of Te Tiriti and the rights of Indigenous peoples. Proponents of these reforms argue that they are necessary to protect the equal rights of all New Zealanders. Drawing on the statements of the CERD and the EMRIP, the Commission has argued in our submissions that this is a flawed approach and a misconception of human rights. As a human rights organisation, we aim to uphold Te Tiriti and Indigenous rights in our structure, processes and activities. A decade ago, we made an explicit commitment to becoming a Tiriti-based organisation. We've established a shared leadership model with a chief executive role shared by Indigenous and non-Indigenous co-leaders. We've created a contracted role to ensure there is an Indigenous rights expertise at governance level. This is because successive governments have declined to appoint an Indigenous rights commissioners to our board. Until that occurs, we will continue to contract in that expertise. We are building Tiriti-based relationships. We have a formal partnership and a shared work program with the National Iwi Chairs Forum, a national body of tribal leaders. As an independent NHRI, we've worked collaboratively with both Indigenous organisations and with government. For example, on the EMRIP's 2019 country visit, and work towards a national action plan for the Declaration. Although the government has stepped away from it, we remain committed to continue this work to put the Declaration into action. Last year, we worked with a range of partners on a constitutional conference looking at what changes are needed to fully protect human rights in Te Tiriti and Aotearoa. Research conducted by the Human Rights Commission in 2024 aimed at understanding New Zealanders' views on Te Tiriti o Waitangi showed that 71% of New Zealanders believe that it's important that Te Tiriti is protected within our laws. Furthermore, 90.2% believe it's important for human rights to be protected in our laws and constitution. While successive governments have ignored UN recommendations to progress constitutional discussions, we can keep trying to push these issues along. We face challenges, including around resourcing and funding. Speaking out on Indigenous rights can attract criticisms and even calls for our abolishment, both from within and outside government. We have been criticised for attending the EMRIP session, even though this is a core aspect of our role. A new unique feature of NHRIs is we are independent, but we are also funded by the government. Our commissioners are appointed by the government. We are government funded, at the same time our role is to hold the government to account. While the government can't tell us what to do, how much we are able to do, of course, depends on our resourcing. We know that many human rights defenders face much harsher struggles, but even in countries like ours that are supposedly rights respecting, the independence of NHRIs can be a delicate balance. We must protect our independence. We must continue to strengthen and prioritise our work on Indigenous people's rights, using the Declaration as our standard of reference. We must promote and protect these rights, even when, and especially when, governments seek to diminish and delete them. We must do this, even though these are the same governments that fund us. We can be supported by this, by EMRIP, Permanent Forum and Special Rapporteur. When these bodies, the CERD and other treaty bodies, make strong statements on the state's obligation, this provides us with valuable tools and levers for our work. We welcome the creation of the GANHRI Indigenous Caucus and the opportunity this offers for support, information sharing and collaboration, and of course we offer our experience and contribution into our collective space. Nō reira, tēnā tātou katoa.
I thank you, Ms. Wapoti, for your statements. Last but not least, through video recording, we will listen to the presentation of His Excellency Edmund Bon Tai Soon, Chair of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights and representative of Malaysia to the AICHR. Edmund is a practicing lawyer with over 25 years of experience working with businesses, states, and non-governmental organizations to promote and protect human rights. He served as Malaysia's representative to AICHR from 2016 to 2017 and was reappointed in 2024. He currently chairs the commission under the Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship. I would now like...
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, although I wish I could have delivered my intervention in person, I thank you for allowing me to say a few words through this recording for the 18th session of the United Nations Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The adoption of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, in 2007 was historic. It affirms the dignity, rights, and agency of indigenous peoples globally. All 10 member states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, voted in favor. However, nearly 2 decades later, there are immense challenges in the realization of the declaration. Regional human rights institutions, such as the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, ICHR, have an important role to play in advancing the UNDRIP. We are situated between the United Nations and national governments such that we can bridge global norms and domestic realities. We can help localize, vernacularize, and operationalize international instruments such as the UNDRIP while reinforcing accountability and coherence across the region. 2025 is an important year not only for Malaysia as the chair of ASEAN, but for ASEAN as a regional bloc. In Kuala Lumpur recently, ASEAN adopted a new vision, ASEAN 2045, Our Shared Future. It is a forward-looking blueprint that charts the course of our region for 20 years. Together with ASEAN strategic plans, it will guide the work of ASEAN institutions, including ICHR, to build a more resilient, inclusive, innovative, dynamic, and people-centered ASEAN. The participation of groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations is also underscored to ensure their full potential and to improve the quality of life for them, ensuring shared prosperity and leaving no one behind. Malaysia's ASEAN chairmanship theme, Inclusivity and Sustainability, reflects this commitment, aligned with our Madani concept, which envisions a compassionate, inclusive, sustainable, and prosperous society. Inclusivity is not just a principle. It is also a test of our current systems, our laws, our governance. It demands that we center the voices made vulnerable and marginalized: women, children, persons with disabilities, indigenous peoples, orang asli, orang asal, migrant workers, refugees, asylum seekers, stateless persons, ethnic, religious, linguistic, and gender minorities, and human rights and environmental rights defenders. They have the right to participate, contribute, and benefit equitably from the political, social, cultural, and economic developments within ASEAN. It is when we design systems and processes that truly serve the most vulnerable that we build a society that works for all. Sustainability, in turn, is rooted in the respect for human rights and environmental stewardship. It cannot just be a buzzword in today's time and age. Without respecting and protecting the rights of people and the planet, there can be no fair, just, or lasting development. According to the World Health Organization, it is estimated that over 216 million indigenous peoples call the Southeast Asia land surface home. The communities often face intersecting challenges, from land dispossession and displacement to limited access to essential services, representation, remedies, and justice. Further, and unfortunately, many indigenous communities are not recognized as such by their governments. Yet they hold traditional and indigenous knowledge and culture that are important to us. Lessons from indigenous ecological stewardship is also badly needed by our region. The UNDRIP is not merely aspirational. It is increasingly being used as a guiding instrument to understand state obligations and as a baseline to develop policies and frameworks concerning the promotion and protection of indigenous people's rights. Further, it supports their right to participate in decision-making on matters that affect their lives, land, culture, and resources. Meaningful participation needs to go far beyond mere consultation. It requires representation, empowerment, informed consent, and equity in outcomes. Since its establishment in 2009, ICHR has served as ASEAN's overarching human rights mechanism. Its convening power has organized more than 155 activities across 40 thematic areas, bringing representatives of government, civil society, national human rights institutions, the private sector, and indigenous communities for dialogue. In December 2024, ICHA hosted its workshop on best practices in promoting indigenous and traditional knowledge in responding and adapting to the impact of climate change. Held in Manila, the Philippines, participants examined the impact of the global climate emergency on indigenous groups and traditional communities, highlighting how their unique perspectives can help address this challenge directly. The sharing of experiences and good practices, particularly by the indigenous from other climate vulnerable areas, such as the Pacific Island states, was extremely valuable to ASEAN. This year, ICHA is looking forward to the much anticipated adoption of the proposed ASEAN Declaration on the right to a safe, clean, healthy, and sustainable environment. This landmark initiative recognizes the interconnectedness of human rights and the environment, including the traditional and indigenous knowledge and techniques that sustain climate resilience in communities. Critically, this declaration seeks to continue ASEAN's commitment in protecting the rights of groups in vulnerable and marginalized situations, including the indigenous peoples. In closing, we must greatly sustain and accelerate the enhancement of our advocacy on UNDRIP with policymakers and non-state actors to take more meaningful, inclusive, and rights-based action to protect the rights of indigenous peoples globally. Thank you.
Thank you for the video statement. Before I turn the floor to the list of speakers, let me ask my colleagues, EMRIP members, if any of you would like to speak. Yes, Sherry.
Thank you very much, Chair, for offering us the floor. And I want to thank all of the panelists for your presentations. We learned a lot about different NHRIs, and I think it's clear that NHRIs are uniquely positioned to bridge the gap between indigenous peoples and governments and international mechanisms and keep those dialogue and conversations very active. So we appreciate you being here today and participating so meaningfully in our discussion. And I also appreciate the range of NHRI models that we heard from in the presentations. Quite a diversity from ombudspersons to indigenous specific commissioners. And I think what we can take away is that there is significant flexibility in institutional design, and that can enable very specific culturally grounded approaches and protection of indigenous people's rights. We heard also some key challenges that have been raised in multiple contexts. Resource limitations is everywhere, and so we all recognize that, and a growing problem of political interference. So thank you, Aotearoa, New Zealand, for those comments. And I think we also, everywhere in the world, experience lack of dedicated legislation on indigenous peoples, as we heard from Cameroon. And we all share the need for increased data visibility and disaggregated statistics, which was the theme of yesterday as well. And so I have a couple questions, if you could think and offer some remarks at the end. One of the pieces that I think about often is institutional independence. So in contexts where NHRIs are government funded, yet tasked with holding the government accountable at the same time, that can create some difficulties and complexities. So what strategies have you found in your contexts that have been effective in safeguarding that kind of independence in often challenging environments? And then secondly, what are your strategies for monitoring the long-term impact and effectiveness of your recommendations? What kind of tracking do you do, or are you able to do over long-term, looking at changes to indigenous people's situations in your countries? So thank you very much for your contributions, and I look forward to hearing the contributions from the floor as well. And thank you again for being part of our conversation.
Thank you. Any other EMRIP member? I don't see. I now turn the floor to the list of speakers. May I give the floor to Norway?
Thank you, Chair. We thank the panelists for their interventions. National human rights institutions and NHRIs play an important role in the effective implementation of human rights, often acting as a bridge builder between the international community, the state, civil society, and other actors. The UN recommends that all states have a national human rights institution to protect and promote human rights within their jurisdiction. The National Human Rights Institution in Norway, or NIM in short, is an independent public body established by the Norwegian Parliament in 2015 to strengthen the implementation of human rights in Norway in accordance with the Constitution, the Human Rights Act, and international human rights law. NIM has A status according to the Paris Principles. With its independence and professional integrity, the National Human Rights Institution in Norway is an important stakeholder in the promotion and monitoring of human rights law at the domestic level. This also includes monitoring, reporting, and advising on the effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. My government values the recommendations from NIM, such as the report on human rights protection against interference in Sami traditional areas. Norway recognizes the significant role that national human rights institutions play in raising awareness about the rights of indigenous peoples, including promoting good practices. NIM has one of its 2 offices in the Sami region in Guadugaino. We appreciate that it spends a considerable part of its resources on the rights of indigenous peoples. NHRIs can also provide relevant advice to both governments and indigenous peoples, and it can empower indigenous peoples to develop their own initiatives grounded in human rights. Finally, Norway welcomes the cooperation between national human rights institutions and regional human rights networks, such as the Global Alliance on National Human Rights Institutions. We encourage all efforts to facilitate collaboration between indigenous peoples, civil society, state institutions, and international bodies. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Articulação de Lideranças do Povo Terrena. It's a joint statement. Yes, you have the floor.
Excelentíssimo membro do mecanismo de espectro representante do Estado-membro e demais presentes, me chamo Célia Alves Gabriel, sou de Pueblo Terrena, do Estado de Mato Grosso do Sul, Brasil. Represento as organizações de Pueblo Terrena de território Buriti e participo do mecanismo de programa de Bencas para Jovens Indígenas 2025 de Acnitudes. Me dirijo a esta sessão com profunda preocupação para denunciar as situações críticas que enfrentam os pueblos indígenas em Brasil. A falta de democracia efetiva de los territórios indígenas em Brasil ameaça a educação física, cultural e espiritual de los pobres indígenas, violentando direitos internacionais, a paralisação do processo de marcação de ameaças de marco temporal, expõe a comunidade evasão mineral legal de terras e defasas de vitalidades de supervivências, autonomia, violências em áreas essenciais como educação de saúde com coisas precárias, falta de doentes bilíngues, barreiras geográficas, desertos escolar, perdidas línguas indígenas e saúde e precariedade dos serviços de escassez de profissionais e de contaminação de rios, pouca atividade legal, ameaças das comunidades. Además, as liderações indígenas continuam sendo criminalizadas, assassinadas e responsabilização, evidência grave a missão do Estado e proteção de seus direitos. Apesar da existência de marcos fundamentais como a Declaração de Nações Unidas sobre os Direitos de Povos Indígenas, UNDRIP, e o Convênio 169 de la OIT, os direitos dos povos indígenas seguem sendo sistematicamente violados. Esta situação continua violando os direitos fundamentais reconhecidos em direitos e instrumentos que garantiram a educação de línguas próprias e as posições de proteção desse território, como o acesso a recurso natural e essencial. Recomendação ao Brasil: demarcações imediatas das terras indígenas, conforme constituições e tratados internacionais, educações intercultural de qualidade, como a cúpula de educação superior, apoio de prosgrados de diversos e escolas indígenas bilíngues, atenção digna de saúde, garantindo acesso à água limpa, infraestrutura adequada e medicamentos profissionais capacitados e efetivo de minério legal. Assegura um futuro acessível para o planeta. Muitas graças.
Thank you, and apologies for the lack of interpretation, but be sure that the statement would be posted and available for others to see. Thank you. I now give the floor to Silokoti in national government. If you are in the room, the representative.
Sierra William Hente. I am Sierra William from the Taitkoti Nation. We welcome this discussion on the role of national and regional human rights institutions. We want to share some experiences from Canada regarding the challenges of using these institutions to address violations of our human rights as protected in Declaration. The Tsaithkotin people know our Indigenous rights, our human rights. However, the Canadian Human Rights Commission, its provincial equivalents, are fortunately limited to only at discrimination and systemic barriers. They have no mandate to address the Declaration and whether it states compliant with it. This is a problematic gap. Fortunately, the Canadian government, as well as some provinces, have enacted the Declaration into Canada's law. As part of implementation efforts, governments are created advisory bodies to monitor implementation. However, it does not appear that these bodies will not meet the standards of Paris principles. They will lack the necessary independence and adequate power, so the lack of appropriate human rights oversight institution continues. This is all the more concerning since the Canadian Supreme Court has recently held the Declaration has been incorporated into Canadian law and provides a framework for interpreting Canadian law and advancing reconciliation. Canada and other states need to ensure that they have local human rights institutions that both have expressed a mandate to consider the Declaration and the compliant with Paris principles, particularly those requiring independence, adequate power. This can be achieved by expanding the mandate of the existing Human Rights Commission or through the creation of the new declaration focused on commissions. We submit the expert mechanism should provide an oversight and guidance to the states on this issue so that the states can properly hold themselves to account for upholding the declaration. Sachenoya, thank you.
I thank you for the statement. I now give the floor to Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Mr. Chair. I speak on behalf of the Arctic region. Inuit and Sami welcome this timely panel discussion on the role of national and regional human rights institutions in achieving the ends of the Declaration. National human rights institutions hold a vital and widely recognized role in defending, monitoring, and reporting the human rights situation in each state, region, or jurisdiction they operate in. However, we can see an unacceptable lack of resources and focus on Indigenous peoples, as well as understanding of and accountability to the rights of Indigenous peoples. We note that there are good examples of improvement of some national human rights institutions to working diligently with the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples, including some of the examples we've heard today. In Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, the Parliament has established a Human Rights Council to advise the Danish Institute for Human Rights, and the Council is structured to specifically include focus on the rights of Indigenous peoples. In Norway, the Human Rights Institution has established an office in the Sami homelands and has Sami members in its board and advisory board. Despite these examples of improvements, lack of financial support for the NHRIs to fully uphold their obligation to report and monitor the human rights situation of Indigenous peoples, both within the states they are accredited in and in other states, continues. Mr. Chair, the key pillars of the Paris Principles based on which the NHRIs operate are pluralism, independence, and effectiveness. The principles include a broad mandate so that NHRIs are, among other things, able to promote and protect all human rights. The principles also include adequate resources, so they have the funding, staffing, infrastructure, and institutional capacity to perform their functions and meet their responsibilities. Furthermore, a principle is international engagement, meaning that the NHRIs should contribute their knowledge and expertise to international and regional human rights bodies and mechanisms. It is unacceptable that it most often lies upon Indigenous peoples themselves to call on their NHRIs to apply the UN Declaration fully and effectively in their work and build expertise and full understanding of the individual and collective rights of Indigenous peoples. Madam Chair, we call on the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions to, in close collaboration with Indigenous peoples, EMRIP and the UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, to strengthen their accreditation mechanisms as well as their focus on Indigenous peoples. No national human rights institution should be able to obtain accreditation if they do not diligently and proactively include Indigenous peoples' rights in their mandates and work. In conclusion, Mr. Chair, we propose to consider how Indigenous peoples, if they so wish, can establish their own national human rights institutions, as we understand that the current mechanisms and principles include limitations to that end. The time is now for all states that champion human rights to step up, to stand strong and work with Indigenous peoples to turn around the devaluation and regression of our rights.
Thank you. for your statement. I now give the floor to the Association Chagosians de France.
Distinguished delegates and member states, the indigenous rights of the Chagosians do not rest on mere assumptions. They are rooted in a profound historical and cultural context that demands recognition and respect. By leveraging the capabilities of regional human rights institutions and national human rights institutions, there exists a potential to apply pressure on the Mauritian and UK governments to acknowledge and uphold these rights. However, the interplay between regional human rights institutions and international legal bodies, such as the International Court of Justice, significantly influences the enforcement of human rights, particularly in the context of the Chagosian indigenous rights. The ICJ ruling on the sovereignty of the Chagos Archipelago has indeed created substantial challenges for the promotion and protection of our rights. Regional human rights institutions may be limited in the power to enforce decisions or recommendations at the national level, especially in the context of geopolitical considerations where member states may prioritize national interests over human rights commitments. The Chagosians, like many indigenous peoples, face systemic discrimination that diminishes our visibility and influence in both national and international human rights dialogues. This marginalization can lead to our issues being deprioritized by institutions meant to protect our rights. Even when regional human rights institutions recognize the rights of the Chagosians, the mechanisms for enforcing compliance by national governments are often weak, leading to unaddressed violations. These institutions can assist in the formulation of policies that incorporate the principles of UNDRIP into national law. This includes advocating for the protection of the Chagosians' cultural identity and rights, which is at high risk of being completely erased by the Mauritian government. Effective implementation requires the involvement of the Chagosians themselves in discussions about their rights and needs. NHRIs can ensure that indigenous people are consulted in the legal and policy reform processes promoting self-determination. Increase international pressure on states to respect indigenous rights, even in the context of sovereignty claims, is essential. This can be achieved through advocacy campaigns, reports, and partnerships with global human rights organizations. There is an urgent need for regional and international bodies to collaborate more effectively with indigenous peoples, ensuring that our voices are heard in legal and political arenas. Building coalitions with civil society and human rights organizations can amplify our unheard calls for justice. I thank you for your attention.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the Philippines Commission on Human Rights.
Assalamualaikum. The Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines, the country's A-status NHRI, is active in its advocacy to protect and promote the rights of indigenous peoples. The UNDRIP and national laws can provide robust protective frameworks that advocate for their rights to self-governance and self-determination. Our recent example of CHRP's advocacy and investigation mandates is in its initiative on monitoring the human rights situation of non-Moro indigenous peoples, a diverse group in Bangsamoro that is classified under the Bangsamoro Organic Law as part of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. Non-Moro indigenous peoples face issues of discrimination, exclusion, land dispossession, and face violence. This, or the dialogues and meetings conducted by the CHRP with the non-Moro indigenous peoples and the government, are documented in the CHRP's 2024 Situation Report on Non-Moro indigenous peoples. Our reporting function is exemplified by our engagements with international human rights mechanisms such as the treaty bodies and EMRIP. CHRP, in its submission to EMRIP for its duty or study on indigenous peoples' right to data, including data collection and disaggregation, emphasized that indigenous peoples must not only be subjects of data, but stewards of it. Advancing the right to data requires free, prior, and informed consent and meaningful collaboration where governments, institutions, and communities co-create systems that uphold dignity, equity, and cultural integrity. NHRIs play that crucial role as facilitator between indigenous peoples and government to ensure that indigenous peoples' rights are protected and promoted. I once again thank the organizers and our audience for this opportunity to speak in this panel. Thank you very much.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to the Danish Institute for Human Rights. You have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Today I speak on behalf of the Danish Institute for Human Rights, following many years of close collaboration with the Human Rights Council of Kalaallit Nunaat, Greenland, and recent dialogue with the Inuit Circumpolar Council. We commend the expert mechanism on the rights of indigenous peoples for addressing the critical role of NHRIs in advancing the effective implementation of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We also commend the report and recommendations made by the former Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Jose Francisco Kalitzai, after his visit to Denmark and Kalaallit Nunaat in 2023. Today we wish to highlight 3 areas that are essential to strengthening the implementation of the declaration in this context. Firstly, enhancing knowledge and implementation of international standards. To ensure that Inuit fully enjoy all the human rights to which they are entitled, including the rights under the Declaration and the ILO Convention 169, it's imperative to strengthen awareness and understanding of these instruments at all levels of government and public administration. Secondly, respect, redress, repair. These words have profound meaning when it comes to addressing systematic human rights violations. For Inuit in Denmark and Kalaallit Nunaat, practices of involuntary contraception and the prevention of Inuit children from tracing their paternity are but some of the violations that must be addressed. We encourage authorities in Denmark to listen to Inuit to understand what respect, redress, and repair means to them. We also encourage listening to other countries and indigenous peoples and learn from their processes of healing. As a national human rights institution, we find great value in learning from other national human rights institutions through the GANHRI Indigenous Peoples Caucus. Thirdly, bridging international standards with local implementation and participation. Monitoring and reporting must be grounded in data collection that respects the rights, dignity, and free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples. In Kalaallit Nunaat, human rights and Inuit-led organizations are central to this work. However, the absence of robust and indigenous-owned data remains a challenge. We therefore recommend the use of tools such as the Indigenous Navigator. Furthermore, bridging the gap between international standards and national reality requires representation. Therefore, we support efforts to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the United Nations. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Social Empowerment Education Program. You have the floor.
Thank Mr. Chair. Bulabinaka, I am Demara Kondende from Fiji and OHCHR Indigenous Fellow 2025. I will be speaking on Agenda Item 5, stated United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the report on the rights of indigenous peoples to their traditional economies, and Agenda Item 8 stated, Panel on National and Regional Human Rights Institutions' role in advancing indigenous peoples' rights and in achieving the ends of the Declaration. Indigenous peoples' rights to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect their rights, which is in Article 18 of the UNDRIP, and states' obligations to consult and cooperate in good faith with the indigenous peoples concerned to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent to legislative and administrative decisions may affect them, which is in Article 19 and Article 32, number 2. The issue in Fiji is the Mining Act, which is on its 11th stage of review. Firstly, the 6 feet under clause in the Mining Act is a barrier to the development of financially disadvantaged resource owners. Secondly, the environmental impact assessment needs to be inclusive of all resource owners at all levels of engagement, with a comprehensive, robust review of the Mining Act 1965 by 2027. Thirdly, there is the exclusion of women's participation in the decision-making process of development. Therefore, we call upon EMRIP to encourage the states of Fiji to first ensure indigenous people's participation within the review of the Mining Act. Secondly, the state to respect the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous peoples through training and capacity building of all the indigenous communities in Fiji. Vinaka, and thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Mauritius.
Chair, Mauritius wishes to make this statement regarding the participation in this forum of individuals claiming to represent the, I quote, indigenous population, unquote, of the Chagos Archipelago. Mauritius reaffirms that there has never been an indigenous population on its entire territory, which includes the Chagos Archipelago. Mauritius is a multiracial and multicultural country populated by people whose ancestors came from Africa, Asia, and Europe, and where all the people enjoy the same rights. Mauritius believes in zero tolerance when it comes to racial discrimination. The claim by some individuals participating in this forum that they represent the, I quote, indigenous population, unquote, of the Chagos Archipelago is therefore baseless and incorrect. Mauritius has ensured the active involvement of Chagosians in its efforts to facilitate their return to the Chagos Archipelago, including in the ICJ advisory proceedings. Although the negotiations on the exercise of sovereignty over the Chagos Archipelago were between the governments of Mauritius and the United Kingdom, the government of Mauritius had regular consultations with Chagosians based in Mauritius to ensure that their rights are safeguarded. The agreement, which Mauritius and the UK signed on 22nd May 2025, addresses the wrongs of the past. In this regard, it provides for the capitalization by the United Kingdom of a trust fund to be established by Mauritius for the benefit of Chagosians. The International Court of Justice has authoritatively determined that the Chagos Archipelago is and has always formed part of Mauritius, and has affirmed that the right to self-determination belonged to and was meant to be exercised by all the people of Mauritius as one territorial unit. It also recognized that the resettlement of Mauritian nationals, including those of Chagosian origin, is to be addressed as part of the complete decolonization process of Mauritius. Mauritians of Chagosian origin, or any of the former inhabitants of the Chagos Archipelago, are therefore not and cannot be considered as an indigenous people or indigenous population. Mauritius therefore reiterates, Chair, that the presence of some individuals claiming to represent the, I quote, indigenous population, unquote, of the Chagos Archipelago in this forum is not warranted and their statements are irrelevant. I thank you.
Thank you for your statements. I now give the floor to Edison Vargas Homanga. May I ask the speaker to turn on the mic, please?
Buenos días, Alto Comisionado del Consejo de Derechos Humanos y al ENHRI. Mi nombre es Edison Vargas Huamanga, soy una autoridad indígena del pueblo quechua de Fuerabamba, del país Perú, América del Sur, de la región Apurímac, provincia Cotabambas, distrito Chalohuacho. Hoy me encuentro aquí para expresar la voz de justicia y queja de mi pueblo indígena de Fuerabamba. Somos el primer pueblo indígena quechua del Perú, desplazado 100% por una empresa privada extranjera china MMG Las Bambas del gobierno. Un hecho histórico y sin precedente en mi país. Nos prometieron cuando nos desplazaron involuntariamente en el 2014 que tendríamos desarrollar justicia y respeto por parte de la empresa MMG Las Bambas del gobierno chino, cuya empresa también tiene inversiones en varias partes del mundo, como Australia, África y otros, y por parte del Estado peruano, luego de 10 años desplazados, no hay cumplimiento de acuerdo. La empresa MMG Las Bambas del gobierno chino nos siguen quitando territorios ancestrales como Tambojasa y Apurímac, Perú, América del Sur, en perjuicio de nuestra vida y salud. Lamentablemente todas las empresas mineras hacen lo mismo, como Glencore, Antapacay, Antamina, Minsur y otros. Cuando protestamos o reclamamos del acuerdo o en compromisos a la empresa MMG Las Bambas del gobierno chino o contra cualquier empresa extranjera, nos criminalizan, nos reprimen policías militares y mercenarios, nos extorsionan y nos tratan como delincuentes en nuestro territorio ancestrales, para desprestigiarnos e intimidarnos. Nuestro gobierno lamentablemente no recoge toda la información de la real situación del pueblo indígena, ni exige las empresas extranjeras en minería cumplan sus compromisos en el pueblo indígenas y se respeta los estándares internacionales de la OIT, Banco Mundial y IFC en materia del desplazamiento y explotación minera. Así, hoy por hoy, la operación de la empresa extranjera china Las Bambas no respeta los derechos humanos, no tiene consulta previa ni ha tenido consentimiento del pueblo indígena como Fuerabamba y otros. No nos sorprende, pues, la presidenta actual dictadura Dina Boluarte, quien entró al poder con graves denuncias constitucionales por asesinato contra el pueblo, y suma a ello el Poder Judicial, el Congreso de la República, la gran prensa y Ministerio Público se unen para violar el derecho humanos de los indígenas. Como autoridad indígena estoy con 70 denuncias perseguidos, difamado y amenazado solo por reclamar el derecho de mi pueblo, Quechua Fuerabamba, por los acuerdos incumplidos por la empresa MMG Las Bambas, avalado por el gobierno del país Perú, América del Sur. En mi país no hay justicia, no hay respeto a los pueblos indígenas, criminalizan a los líderes indígenas como en Fuerabamba, Pumamarca, Huancuyre, Tintaya, Marquira, Cujani, y así en regiones de mi país, Perú. Por eso me encuentro hoy aquí para buscar la justicia y solidaridad. Por ello solicito al ENHRI y alto comisionado que emita un pronunciamiento público por esta situación grave de violencia de derechos humanos y que llame al Estado peruano y al Estado chino
Your
a
time
dialogar.
is up. Thank you. I now give the floor to Tauki. Tauki from the Pacific.
Katoa. My name is Claire Charters and I'm from the nation of Ngāti Whakaowea. I speak on behalf of Pautikanga of the National Tribal Nations Chairs Forum of Aotearoa New Zealand and the Aotearoa Centre for Indigenous Peoples in the Law. The National Tribal Nations Chairs Forum is made up of leaders from over 80 Māori nations who carry mandates from their peoples. Our Pautikanga Collective ensures that tikanga, our laws, is embedded across all areas of our decision-making, including in our engagements with the government and international institutions. The close relationship between the National Tribal Nations Chairs Forum and the Human Rights Commission is an important model for partnerships between NHRIs and national tribal nations. Together we promote the government's compliance with the Declaration. For example, we co-hosted constitutional conferences on the rights of Indigenous peoples. We co-hosted the informal academic visit of the former Special Rapporteur in 2024. We co-hosted the 2019 country engagement with the expert mechanism to support the development of a national plan of action. We worked in partnership to develop that national plan of action, which has now been unilaterally cancelled by the government. Together, we also coordinate on the annual report to the expert mechanism on New Zealand's performance against the Declaration and on submissions to the various human rights treaty bodies. The National Tribal Nations Body and the Human Rights Commission together appoint the Rongomo Takitaki, the Indigenous Rights Governance Partner, which is a workaround for to get around the government's refusal to appoint an Indigenous Rights Commissioner. And it was a role that I was very privileged to hold. The support of the National Human Rights Commission is crucial in a political context where coalition partners in New Zealand's current government expressly reject the Declaration. Just this week, the Deputy Prime Minister described in New Zealand's most well-read newspaper the Special Rapporteur's letter expressing concern with New Zealand's current policy, diminishing our rights as an affront to New Zealand's sovereignty and offensive. Statements like this from New Zealand's Deputy Prime Minister undermine our international human rights and the structure generally. It reduces New Zealand's authority to call out human rights abuse globally. Further, the Deputy Prime Minister breached the requirement of confidentiality of Special Rapporteur's correspondence with governments. This is literally the hottest news item at the moment in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Deputy Prime Minister has been reprimanded by the Prime Minister, but however, the Prime Minister has simultaneously confirmed that he agrees with the content of the Deputy Prime Minister's letter. We look forward to working together with the Human Rights Commission to address this egregious breach of the human rights process. Kia ora koutou katoa.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Deoran.
Monsieur le Président, permettez-moi de dire que cette opportunité de pouvoir porter la voix de toute une communauté assez marginalisée pendant des années et qui continue d'être marginalisée encore pendant des années. La population Peul, disons le peuple Peul, la nation Peul au Burkina Faso subit depuis 2015 une situation dramatique. Malheureusement, les institutions nationales qui sont supposées remonter les informations concernant les massacres que subissent les Peuls ne sont pas du tout mentionnés dans ce rapport. Nous invitons donc à ce que le MEDPA prenne en compte réellement la situation urgente de stopper le nettoyage Peul au Burkina Faso. Et nous demandons à ce que, dans la mise en application de la déclaration, qu'on puisse tenir compte de la réalité malheureuse que subissent les peuples Peul et que malheureusement les Peuls ne sont pas reconnus comme peuple autochtone au Burkina Faso. C'est une situation assez dramatique, une situation assez difficile pour la jouissance de leurs droits. Et en plus de cette possibilité de pouvoir reconnaître les peuples et de permettre de jouir de leurs droits fondamentaux. Malheureusement, l'État burkinabé, à travers l'institution nationale, ne tient pas compte vraiment de la réalité des peuples, ne fait pas une documentation claire de ce qui se passe par rapport à la situation des peuples aujourd'hui au Burkina Faso. Nous comptons des milliers de réfugiés en Côte d'Ivoire, des milliers de réfugiés au Ghana, des milliers de réfugiés au Togo, et nos villages sont carrément nettoyés dans le cadre de la lutte contre le terrorisme. Et c'est malheureux parce qu'il n'y a pas de documentation claire, parce que le gouvernement burkinabé a pris une décision assez claire. Il n'y a pas de documentation, il n'y a pas de médias qui doivent documenter ce qui se passe sur le terrain. C'est malheureux ce qui se passe par rapport à notre situation en tant que communauté Peul, en tant que peuple Peul du Burkina Faso. Nous demandons donc, pour permettre à ce qu'il y ait une mise en clair de la situation, qu'il y ait une possibilité de la mise en place de la déclaration, que le METMA engage une procédure, des enquêtes pour permettre de comprendre comment le Burkina Faso met en place cette déclaration, parce qu'ils ont rectifié. Je vous remercie.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Bolivia.
Presidente, Jayaya hermano, Jayaya significa en idioma aymara por la vida. El Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia saluda fraternalmente a las y los representantes de los pueblos indígenas presentes en la sala y reitera su respaldo al trabajo del EMRIP. Reconocemos que las instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos son actores clave para promover la implementación de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas. Bolivia cuenta con un defensor del pueblo. De manera simultánea, el gobierno ha establecido a través del Decreto Supremo la Comisión para la Presentación de Informes de Estado sobre Derechos Humanos y para Desapariciones Forzadas, CEPIE, una instancia de coordinación interinstitucional que permite, a través del seguimiento a recomendaciones de mecanismos internacionales de protección de derechos humanos, entre ellas el examen periódico universal, profundizar la protección, respeto y garantía de los derechos humanos. Bolivia también mantiene una relación de trabajo con las instituciones regionales. Por ejemplo, en 2022 se constituyó la Mesa de Seguimiento a la Implementación de las Recomendaciones del GIEI, junto a la Comisión Interamericana de Derechos Humanos. Asimismo, recientemente se adoptó en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos nuestros resultados del 4º Examen Periódico Universal, mecanismos del Sistema Universal, que busca impulsar, apoyar, ampliar la promoción y protección de los derechos humanos. Para finalizar, hermano presidente, queremos destacar el desarrollo y futura implementación de un nuevo mecanismo en la región de América Latina, en la Amazonía del Abya-Yala. Me refiero al mecanismo amazónico de los pueblos indígenas de la Organización del Tratado de Cooperación Amazónica, OTCA, una iniciativa que Bolivia, en su calidad de coordinador del grupo de trabajo y junto a países miembros del OTCA, han acordado un proceso para implementarla. Este mecanismo busca elevar la inclusión y participación de los pueblos indígenas. Entre sus actividades futuras, podrá desarrollar planes de trabajo para asistir a los Estados miembros de la OTCA y sus pueblos indígenas en y para la protección y promoción de sus derechos. Por el alto valor de nuestra Amazonía, madre tierra, de sus habitantes ancestrales, solicitamos respetuosamente pueda el EMRIP tomar nota e incluir en su informe la mención y aliento para este logro, el mecanismo amazónico de los pueblos indígenas de la Organización del Tratado de Cooperación Amazónica, OTCA. Gracias.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Bangladesh Indigenous Youth Forum. You have the floor.
Honorable Chair, thank you for giving the floor, and also I would like to thank UN Voluntary Fund. National Human Rights Commission in various countries can play an important role in upholding the rights of indigenous peoples. The National Human Rights Commission of Bangladesh is no exception. Therefore, I appreciate the engagement of the expert mechanism with a commission. The Constitution of Bangladesh does not recognize indigenous peoples as indigenous peoples. Instead, it refers to them as tribes, minor race, ethnic acts, and communities, which has caused confusion and as considered disrespectful and not accepted by the indigenous peoples. However, with constitutional reform currently underway under the interim government, there is an opportunity to officially recognize indigenous peoples and their rights. The National Human Rights Commission can apply a significant role in supporting the recognition. Unfortunately, due to the current unstable political situation in Bangladesh, the National Human Rights Commission is not active at that moment. The Commission has not yet been reconstituted as its previous term expired in November last year. However, the government has pledged to form a new National Human Rights Commission. There are more than 54 indigenous peoples groups in Bangladesh. Their cultures, languages, customs, and traditions are on the verge of extinction due to the lack of officially recognized as indigenous peoples. Therefore, I call on the expert mechanism to engage with the National Human Rights Commission to support the recognition of indigenous peoples as well as their rights to self-determination, self-governance, land, territories, and natural resources. I also urge support for the rights to be prior and informed consent and the protection of cultural rights as enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Russian Federation.
Уважаемый господин председатель, уважаемые коллеги, Российская Федерация осуществляет политику широкого юридического признания коллективных и индивидуальных прав коренных народов. Многие из них ведут кочевой или полукочевой образ жизни. Это требует специальных механизмов фактического обеспечения их прав, включая независимые правозащитные институты, обладающие ресурсами для эффективной реализации своего мандата. Например, российское законодательство предусматривает институт региональных уполномоченных по правам коренных народов. Такие омбудсмены имеют свой административный аппарат и особые полномочия в отношении с правительственными и частными структурами. Занимая высокие государственные должности, они не находятся в прямом подчинении властей и пользуются другими законодательными гарантиями невмешательства в свою деятельность. За последние 2 года парламенты еще 2 российских регионов приняли законы и избрали омбудсменов из кандидатур, предложенных организациями коренных народов по разработанным ими процедурам. Однако, учреждение специальных омбудсменов по правам коренных народов является правом, а не обязанностью регионов. Это ограничивает их институциональное развитие и роль в продвижении национального договорного процесса о правах коренных народов. При этом на глобальном уровне универсальные стандарты мандата таких омбудсменов, в том числе и в области их гарантий, полномочий и механизмов работы, также по-настоящему не сложились. Считаем это предметом будущей работы вспомогательных органов Организации Объединенных Наций. Другими формами осуществления правозащитной деятельности коренных народов России являются образуемые по требованию федерального закона советы их уполномоченных представителей при региональных представительствах и главах муниципалитетов. Однако говорить об их устойчивой эффективности рано. Требуется совершенствование их полномочий и процедур формирования. Также в федеральных, региональных и муниципальных парламентских структурах действуют профильные подразделения по вопросам коренных народов и десятки их парламентариев, в том числе на уровне представителей региональных парламентов и их заместителей. Их статус также позволяет осуществлять правозащитную деятельность. Считаем, что потенциал правозащитных институтов коренных народов в регионах мира не использован полностью, а их юридическое признание и роль требует расширения. Это отвечает запросам коренных народов и повышает эффективность государственных национальных политик. В этой связи мы поддерживаем расширение таких усилий, а также роли правозащитных учреждений и парламентариев коренных народов в работе вспомогательных органов Организации Объединенных Наций. Это учитывает резолюцию 33/25 Совета по правам человека, а также расширит горизонтальные и вертикальные связи правозащитных учреждений коренных народов, усилив их потенциал. Спасибо за внимание.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Gegana Weni Mana Ning. Sorry, this is difficult to pronounce, but if you are around, please show your hand. Gegana Weniman Naning. Yes. Please.
Muchísimas gracias, señor presidente. Intervengo por primera vez en el 18 periodo de sesiones del Mecanismo de Expertos sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y realizo esta intervención en nombre de la Organización del Tratado de Cooperación Amazónica. La OTCA es un organismo intergubernamental constituida en julio de 1978 por 8 países amazónicos, Bolivia, Brasil, Colombia, Ecuador, Guyana, Perú, Surinam y Venezuela, que suscribieron el Tratado de Cooperación Amazónica, constituyéndose en el único bloque socioambiental de América Latina. La región amazónica, en datos, representa el 40% del territorio de América del Sur y en ella habitan 50 millones de personas, incluyendo más de 500 pueblos indígenas, 69 territorios transfronterizos, 66 pueblos indígenas que viven en aislamiento y contacto inicial y son reconocidas formalmente por los estados. Según datos de los investigadores y los propios pueblos indígenas, alcanza a 180. 180 millones de hectáreas del bosque protegido están entre 346 territorios indígenas tituladas, demarcadas y saneadas colectivamente, y de ellas el 45% del bosque intacto amazónico se encuentra en territorios indígenas. Por lo tanto, es importante garantizar los derechos colectivos a las tierras, territorios y recursos, al consentimiento previo, libre e informado, a la participación plena y efectiva de los pueblos indígenas amazónicos en la toma de decisiones que promueva sus formas de vida, la conservación de su cultura y de su territorio. Señor presidente, hace poco la OTCA cumplió 47 años y recién los países miembros, en el marco de la Declaración de Belén de la Cumbre de Presidentes de agosto de 2023, decidieron establecer el mecanismo amazónico de los pueblos indígenas, que tendrá como objetivo de fortalecer y promover el diálogo entre los gobiernos y los pueblos indígenas amazónicos para la gestión y coordinación sobre los asuntos que conciernen a los pueblos indígenas y a la propia Amazonía. En cumplimiento de ese mandato, los líderes de la Amazonía conformaron un grupo de trabajo compuesto por los delegados de gobierno y delegados de los pueblos indígenas amazónicas para el diseño de las bases y estructura de funcionamiento de este mecanismo. Después de un largo proceso de negociación, el documento está a punto de concluir, que garantizará la gobernanza paritaria que incluye a los delegados de gobierno y pueblos indígenas. Finalmente, quiero mencionar, el 22 de agosto de 2025 en Bogotá, Colombia, se realizará la Cumbre de Presidentes, en la que se adoptará, entre otros, el mecanismo amazónico de pueblos indígenas. Muchísimas gracias, señor presidente.
I thank you. I now give the floor to Burundi.
Monsieur le Président, le gouvernement du Burundi a mis en place des institutions suffisantes chargées de promouvoir et protéger les droits humains en général et ceux des peuples autochtones en particulier, dont le ministère en charge des droits de la personne humaine, l'Institut de l'Ombudsman, la Commission Vérité et Réconciliation, la Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme, avec son accréditation au statut A, l'Observatoire national pour la prévention du génocide, des crimes de guerre et des crimes contre l'humanité, le Centre de promotion des droits de la personne humaine et de prévention du génocide, le Conseil national pour l'unité nationale, la réinstitutionnalisation du Conseil des notables collinaires et j'en passe. La Commission nationale indépendante des droits de l'homme du Burundi, qui vient d'obtenir une reconnaissance internationale majeure et de conserver son statut A, gage de son indépendance et de sa conformité aux principes de Paris, décision prise par le sous-comité d'accréditation de l'Alliance globale des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme, joue un rôle primordial dans la promotion et la protection des droits catégoriels au Burundi, dont ceux des peuples autochtones et batois. Il organise des séances de renforcement des capacités des organisations des peuples autochtones et participe dans la célébration de la Journée internationale des peuples autochtones. Dans sa mission de plaidoirie auprès du gouvernement, il contribue à la recherche des solutions durables pour les vulnérables en veillant à la mise en œuvre de la stratégie nationale de réintégration économique des personnes déplacées internes en général et les batois en particulier. La CNDH garantit la protection des droits fondamentaux des batois à travers l'assistance judiciaire et légale, l'accès à la documentation et autres services publics, comme l'octroi des cartes nationales d'identité, qui sont des documents essentiels pour le citoyen pour assurer leur identification et faciliter l'accès aux services, notamment dans le domaine de l'état civil et des élections. Des cartes d'assurance maladie les sont octroyées aussi pour leur permettre d'accéder aux soins de santé pour promouvoir la solidarité nationale et garantir une protection sociale. Ainsi, 3 000 cartes nationales d'identité et 2 000 cartes d'assurance maladie ont été octroyées aux batois de la province du nord du pays. Malgré les efforts consentis, les défis subsistent concernant l'accès à la terre et à l'éducation. La CNDH a un atout important qui tient du fait qu'il joue d'une excellente collaboration avec les partenaires nationaux qui s'occupent au quotidien des peuples autochtones et batois et les partenaires internationaux et aux agences du système des Nations Unies qui l'aident dans ses efforts de relever la situation des peuples autochtones et batois au Burundi. Ce partenariat permet de voir que, malgré les défis, une évolution significative dans le domaine des droits des peuples autochtones s'opère au Burundi. Je vous remercie.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Venezuela.
Muchas gracias, estimados expertos. Agradecemos la celebración de la 18ª sesión de Mecanismo de Expertos de las Naciones Unidas sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, espacio que nos convoca a reflexionar y debatir sobre temas de especial relevancia para la promoción, protección y pleno disfrute de los derechos de los pueblos y comunidades indígenas. En base al tema central de esta mesa, destacamos que el Estado venezolano cuenta con una institución nacional de derechos humanos, la Defensoría del Pueblo, la cual tiene por objetivo promover, defender y vigilar el respeto de los derechos y garantías consagrados en la Constitución y en los tratados internacionales válidamente suscritos y ratificados por la República, así como proteger los intereses legítimos y colectivos de la ciudadanía. En consonancia con la alta prioridad que el Estado venezolano otorga a los derechos humanos, la Defensoría del Pueblo ha fortalecido su estructura mediante la creación de defensorías especiales, unidades que brindan asistencia técnica en materia que requieren un enfoque diferencial, con el fin de diseñar y coordinar acciones de promoción, defensa y vigilancia de los derechos humanos en coordinación con sus direcciones generales y demás dependencias. En ese sentido, destacamos la creación de una Defensoría Delegada Especial para la Protección de los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, establecida en junio de 2003. Este órgano asesora, coordina y emprende las acciones necesarias destinadas a fortalecer la identidad cultural de los pueblos y comunidades indígenas, a la protección de sus derechos humanos conforme a nuestra Constitución, la Ley Orgánica de los Pueblos y Comunidades Indígenas y los tratados internacionales ratificados por la República. La labor de esta Defensoría Delegada Especial se centra en garantizar el derecho de los pueblos indígenas a mantener y reforzar sus estructuras propias, promover su participación efectiva en la toma de decisiones y apoyar iniciativas que fomenten el desarrollo sostenible, el respeto a la diversidad cultural y a la protección de sus territorios ancestrales. Como buena práctica en materia legislativa, destacamos que los derechos de los pueblos indígenas están consagrados en nuestra Constitución, que en su capítulo 8 dedica 8 artículos detallando sus derechos fundamentales. Esta base constitucional se complementa con lo dispuesto en la Ley Orgánica de Pueblos y Comunidades Indígenas de 2005, que desarrolla estas disposiciones y brinda protección integral a todos sus derechos. Para concluir, el Estado venezolano reafirma su disposición de seguir colaborando activamente con este mecanismo de expertos para identificar buenas prácticas que contribuyan a garantizar plenamente los derechos de los pueblos y de las comunidades indígenas. Muchas gracias.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Chile.
Señor presidente, el Estado de Chile expresa su compromiso con la Declaración de Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas en lo que refiere a la igualdad de acceso y disfrute de los derechos por parte de los pueblos indígenas, así como en la promoción de su participación en la toma de decisiones. Estos esfuerzos se han dado de manera permanente y continua a través de instrumentos internacionales que se han visto incorporados al ordenamiento nacional a través de la Ley Indígena número 19.253 y el decreto número 66 del Ministerio de Desarrollo Social, que establece el reglamento de consulta indígena. Actualmente se desarrollan decenas de procesos de consulta que convocan a distintos pueblos, con participación en distintos niveles según el alcance territorial en ámbitos como medio ambiente, minería, energía, vivienda y obras públicas. Junto a ello, se ha desarrollado un trabajo permanente de revisión y adecuación del derecho a la participación y la consulta indígena. En lo que respecta a las instituciones nacionales, la Comisión Presidencial para la Paz y el Entendimiento es una de las instancias más relevantes, que tiene el objetivo de construir y consolidar una solución de largo plazo al conflicto territorial en diversas regiones del país, con participación de integrantes del pueblo mapuche y cuyas recomendaciones están en proceso de implementación. Asimismo, Chile puede dar cuenta de la participación de mujeres indígenas en la vida pública, en espacios institucionales como el Congreso Nacional, el Consejo Nacional de la Corporación Nacional del Desarrollo Indígena, la Comisión de Desarrollo de la Isla de Pascua, alcaldías, concejalías, el Comité Asesor en Patrimonio Cultural Inmaterial y en futuras instancias alineadas con la Estrategia Nacional del Litio. Señor presidente, como Estado de Chile nos hemos comprometido a impulsar la promoción y ejercicio de los derechos culturales lingüísticos de los pueblos indígenas, coordinando la implementación de las medidas relacionadas a través del Ministerio de Desarrollo Social y Familia. Así, se continúa trabajando arduamente en el diseño del Plan Decenal de Lenguas Indígenas para reparar y responder a las demandas de los pueblos referidas a revitalizar, preservar y promover sus lenguas. Agradecemos al mecanismo de expertos por su liderazgo en la promoción de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, incluida la promoción y participación en la toma de decisiones, e instamos a los estados a adoptar prácticas eficaces con el fin de avanzar en la mejor aplicación de la declaración. Muchas gracias.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Indigenous Peoples International Center for Policy Research and Education. Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. Regional and national human rights institutions play an important role in the overall human rights system. We regret that Asia, home to 2/3, or about 350 million, of the world's indigenous peoples, remains the only region without a comprehensive region-wide human rights system or instrument. We continue to call for the creation of a comprehensive regional mechanism and instruments for better recognition, promotion, and protection of our rights as indigenous peoples in Asia, in all the Asian subregions. We thank the current ICHR chairperson from Malaysia for his presentation and congratulate ICHR Philippines for organizing the inaugural workshop on best practices in promoting indigenous and traditional knowledge in responding and adapting to climate change. While we are greatly concerned that the issue of indigenous peoples remains a sensitive issue in Asia, indigenous peoples' knowledge and the desire to find common solutions to the existential threat of climate change seems to be a common ground that indigenous peoples and Asian governments can build on. Therefore, we recommend that the AICHR continue facilitating similar workshops in all ASEAN member states to better understand the concept of indigenous peoples and their contributions to biodiversity and climate action. We welcome the efforts of ICHR Malaysia representatives to develop communication materials on indigenous peoples and urge the ICHR in all ASEAN countries to conduct field visits and develop more case studies, reports, and materials in partnership with indigenous peoples. We congratulate the ICHR in submitting the ASEAN Declaration on the Right to a Safe, Clean, Healthy, and Sustainable Environment for adoption. We understand that the current proposal contains explicit language on indigenous peoples and free, prior, and informed consent, and we urge the ASEAN to keep such language intact in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We urge the ICHR to ensure indigenous peoples' meaningful participation in developing the regional action plans on the declaration, as well as the ASEAN Declaration on the Right to Development. We believe that ICHR can learn from the debates here on enhanced participation, and we recommend a review of the accreditation mechanism to enable broader participation and to implement creative mechanisms to engage with indigenous peoples on the ground. Finally, there are many good examples of the work of NHRIs with indigenous peoples, and we call on ICHR to improve its interface with NHRIs, moving beyond political debate and the non-interference approach to problem solving with indigenous peoples. Thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Indonesia. Indonesia, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Indonesia welcomes this timely panel discussion. We recognize the important role of national human rights institutions, including our own National Human Rights Commission, or Komnas HAM, in promoting and protecting the rights of marginalized and vulnerable groups. Moreover, Indonesia values regional mechanisms that emphasize dialogue, mutual respect, and constructive cooperation as exemplified within ASEAN frameworks. Mr. Chair, in our national context, Indonesia affirms the right of masyarakat adat or adat communities, which are enshrined in our constitution and embedded within our legal and institutional system. Our National Human Rights Institution, Komnas HAM, has worked closely with stakeholders to address the rights of these communities through complaints handling, monitoring efforts, and policy advocacy. Within our vibrant civil society landscape, the government sees that civil society organizations and Komnas HAM play a vital role in amplifying the voices of adat communities, particularly in the realization of their rights. Recently, Komnas HAM launched a normative standards and guidelines on the protections of the rights of masyarakat adat. This document provides a national framework to guide all stakeholders in promoting the respect, protection, fulfillment, and restoration of adat communities' rights consistent with universal human rights principles and our Constitution. Mr. Chair, Indonesia believes that context-sensitive approaches are essential. Each country must be granted the space to interpret and implement indigenous rights according to its legal, historical, and cultural realities. Our adat communities are custodians of traditional knowledge, local wisdom, and sustainable natural resource management. Their contributions are integral to our collective development. In closing, we have a question to the panelists. In the context of diverse legal systems across ASEAN, how can we ensure that regional cooperation does not lead to normative homogenization, but instead strengthen human rights protection that is responsive to each state's cultural, historical, and legal particularities? I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Assemblée de Première Nation Québec et du Labrador.
Koi Krasnoyarsk. Hello. Kwekesnochek. Je suis Francis Véropol, chef de l'Assemblée des Premières Nations Québec-Labrador. Mon intervention s'inscrit dans le cadre du thème portant sur le rôle des institutions nationales et régionales des droits de l'homme dans la réalisation des objectifs de la Déclaration des Nations unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Ce thème est crucial car il met en lumière l'écart persistant entre les engagements formels des États et leur mise en œuvre effective sur le terrain. Le Canada a adopté la DNUDPA et l'a intégrée dans sa législation. Le Québec, de son côté, a adopté plusieurs motions affirmant son intention de la mettre en œuvre. Pourtant, ces engagements demeurent trop souvent théoriques. C'est ici que les institutions nationales et régionales des droits de l'homme ont un rôle fondamental à jouer. Elles doivent veiller à ce que les droits reconnus soient respectés, protégés et promus de manière concrète. Au niveau fédéral, une nouvelle loi sur les grands projets d'intérêt national menace notre droit au consentement préalable, libre et éclairé. Au Québec, une réforme du régime forestier est en cours affectant directement nos territoires, nos cultures et nos modes de vie, sans consultation adéquate, sans reconnaissance de nos gouvernements, sans respect de nos savoirs. Ces situations ne sont pas isolées. Elles révèlent un problème systémique. Les institutions des droits de l'homme doivent agir comme des gardiennes vigilantes en assurant un suivi rigoureux des politiques publiques, en soutenant la réconciliation législative et en favorisant la reconnaissance des systèmes normatifs autochtones. Cela contribuerait à une plus grande stabilité juridique et à un environnement d'affaires plus prévisible. Nous croyons au dialogue et à un avenir durable pour nos peuples, mais ce dialogue doit être fondé sur l'égalité, la bonne foi et le respect réel de nos droits ancestraux et titres. Les institutions des droits de l'homme ont la responsabilité de promouvoir une transformation des relations entre les États et les peuples autochtones vers un véritable partenariat fondé sur le respect des droits fondamentaux. Plutôt que de craindre un prétendu droit de veto, les États gagneraient à adopter une approche constructive en intégrant pleinement la DNUDPA dans leur cadre législatif, en renforçant les processus de consultation et de co-développement des politiques publiques, avec l'appui actif des institutions des droits de l'homme. Malgré le contexte géopolitique mondial, ce n'est pas une raison de reléguer au second rang la réconciliation législative avec les Autochtones, tout en diminuant l'importance des changements climatiques, de la conservation des écosystèmes et de la biodiversité. Nous lançons un appel clair. Les grands projets économiques ne peuvent être conçus sans le consentement préalable, libre et éclairé des peuples autochtones. Ils doivent être réalisés dans un esprit de gouvernement à gouvernement, reflétant des partenariats sincères et justes fondés sur la codécision et le respect mutuel. Tinishku maintenant.
I thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to the Chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Good morning, and thank you, Chair, and thank you, panelists. National and regional human rights institutions play a vital role in supporting the implementation of UNDRIP. Through independent monitoring and accountability, they assess how national laws and practices align with UNDRIP standards. Many national and regional human rights institutions also offer complaint and redress mechanisms that can provide accessible justice for Indigenous peoples, particularly where formal courts are inaccessible. Through public education and awareness efforts, national and regional human rights institutions help combat discrimination and promote understanding of Indigenous peoples' rights. In their advisory capacity, they can influence legal and policy reforms in critical areas such as land rights, education, and consultation. For instance, in the Inter-American Human Rights System, the ruling of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in the Saramacca People case versus Suriname requested the government to legally recognize the rights of the Saramacca people to ancestral lands. National and regional human rights institutions also contribute significantly to data collection and reporting, ensuring that Indigenous peoples' issues are visible in national and international human rights dialogues. To be effective, however, their work must be based on respectful, culturally sensitive collaboration with Indigenous peoples, including the recognition of Indigenous governance systems. National and regional human rights institutions complement these efforts by providing additional platforms for advocacy and issuing key legal decisions that uphold the rights of Indigenous peoples, especially concerning land, consent, and cultural identity. The Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues has issued numerous recommendations to national and regional human rights institutions over the years. For example, the forum recommended that national human rights institutions and commissions address Indigenous peoples' issues and include Indigenous experts as members of such bodies. The Permanent Forum recommended that the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights recognize the human rights of Indigenous peoples in the ASEAN Declaration on Human Rights and establish a working group on Indigenous peoples. The Permanent Forum encouraged national human rights institutions to work with Indigenous peoples to develop strategies to protect and provide support to Indigenous human rights defenders. The Permanent Forum appreciated the participation and active input of national and regional human rights institutions and encouraged those institutions to prepare studies and reports in the promotion and protection of Indigenous peoples' rights and invited those institutions to present their reports and studies in future sessions of the forum. The realization of the rights of Indigenous peoples as outlined in UNDRIP requires more than aspiration. It requires action, institutional commitment, and partnership. National and regional human rights institutions are indispensable allies on this journey. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to my colleague, Binota.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to share my general perspectives on this item. I thank you to the panelists, the experts, the delegates, and Indigenous peoples representatives who made the intervention on this. I especially thank the chair of the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights for their commitment to promote the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples in the ASEAN framework for the protection and advancement of Indigenous peoples' rights. Mr. Chair, while we are taking part in this dialogue, we also heard the statement raised about the identity and recognition issues of Indigenous peoples. The identity of Indigenous peoples and their rights goes beyond the concept of colonization and decolonization process. One situation involves the persistence of colonization, even after the overseas colonizers have departed or left. The natives who were the victors of the anti-colonization struggles established the independent nation state and often rallied the people within its boundaries to establish one nation, one culture, and one language. The historical reality is that some nation states forcibly integrated territories belonging to Indigenous peoples or included them as part of their territorial claims as part of the nation building and state building process. Whatever claims countries have in terms of presence or absence of Indigenous peoples, what is clear is that there are groups of peoples who still continue to practice their own cultures and traditions and their livelihoods, which are closely linked with nature, their lands, territories, and resources. They still suffer from racism and discrimination, which are institutionalized in policies and laws and practiced by those from the dominant populations. These peoples aspire to pass on their lands, territories, and resources, as well as their language, identities, cultures, and traditions, and also their social and political governance systems to the future generations. Even if they are not recognized by the state as Indigenous peoples, they can still assert their identities and claim their rights as contained in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and other international human rights laws. And these aspirations and demands have to be addressed by the states and the international community. What are Indigenous peoples seeking? It is the recognition of their human rights in the nation-state boundary, which are established under international human rights law. National Human Rights Commission or institutions or regional human rights bodies can play vital roles in this. In countries where Indigenous peoples have been struggling for recognition of their human rights to survive with respect and dignity in line with international human rights law as distinct peoples, I encourage member states to consider inviting and engaging with EMRIP, encouraging the National Human Rights Commission with resources to engage for Indigenous peoples' human rights. This joint engagement will help advancing Indigenous peoples' human rights, including clarification and explanation for developing laws, policies, and constitutional development on Indigenous peoples' rights at the national level. The Constitution is the highest law in the national legal context and provides a framework, and the constitutional recognition of Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples will provide an avenue for Indigenous peoples to enjoy their human rights and for the development of a domestic legal and policy framework. I encourage member states to be more open and inclusive for indigenous peoples. States should not see indigenous peoples as their enemy, but as a friend and partner, collaborating in advancing their human rights in harmony with their culture, language, and identity. I thank you.
Thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to South Africa. South Africa, if you are in the room, you have the floor. I think we don't see.
The room, sorry, Chair. My computer froze. Thank you very much, Chairperson. My delegation thanks the panelists for their invaluable insights shared with us this morning. Our democratic country emerged from centuries of colonialism and apartheid that ensured that social groups were hierarchically graded and that some had a heritage that was not freely appreciated and promoted. The cultural heritage of people indigenous to South Africa was in the past marginalized and demonized by colonizers, this also affecting critical aspects of our traditions and heritage linked to land, ownership, language, use, livelihoods, and social structures. The South African Human Rights Commission has been involved in monitoring the realization of rights of indigenous peoples in South Africa, and since its inauguration in 1995 has been very active. South Africa stands as one of the few countries on the continent that has embarked on ambitious efforts aimed at redressing the problems of indigenous peoples, including through legislative, policy, and judicial interventions. Our young democracy has made many gains, and we are equally aware that we have much to do to achieve a fully democratic, non-racial, non-sexist society, a future that we all dream of and are responsible for making a reality. In light of this pursuit for an inclusive and equitable society, our democratic government has made a series of sectoral advancements, which include the implementation of a range of measures to build social cohesion, increasingly introducing indigenous languages in public schools, with over 2,400 targeted in this term of government. This aims to foster a greater understanding of different cultures between learners and break down cultural barriers. Chairperson, UNESCO declared the year 2022 to 2032 as an international decade of indigenous languages. The declaration provides an opportunity for us all to intensify ways in which we develop, preserve, and promote our South African indigenous languages to reach the status of the world-acclaimed languages of business. As I conclude, I wish to say that as a country, we will continue with these endeavors, not only to embrace our culture, heritage, and indigenous knowledge, but also to safeguard the interests of the kind of future that we aspire for, a future rooted in democracy, social cohesion, economic prosperity, and enhanced unity in our diversity. I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now turn the floor to my colleague, Antonina.
Спасибо большое, господин председатель. Я хочу поблагодарить за эту дискуссию, за содержательное выступление панелистов и прозвучавшие в этом зале заявления участников сессии. Сложно переоценить важность роли правозащитных институтов, где особое значение имеет выстраивание эффективного, вовлеченного диалога как с государством, так и непосредственно с сообществами коренных народов. Стоит приветствовать включение коренных народов и международных стандартов о правам коренных народов в работу национальных правозащитных институтов, как озвучила представитель Циркумполярного совета инуитов. Также стоит приветствовать создание правозащитных учреждений по инициативе самих коренных народов, приемлемых в их культурном отношении. Важно обеспечить право коренных народов самим влиять на назначение экспертов в такие национальные правозащитные институты. Мы услышали сегодня существующие примеры такого подхода. Многие спикеры и мои коллеги сегодня об этом говорили. Требуется ресурсное обеспечение мандата, обеспечение независимости правозащитного института, их признание сообществами коренных народов на местах. Требуется обеспечение высокого потенциала для защиты прав коренных народов, систематизации и анализа проблематики, продвижения решений, законотворческих изменений и инициатив. В контексте этой дискуссии Мы увидели также обозначенную в нашем текущем исследовании проблематику данных, их наличие в целом, а также сбора и дезагрегации, и ту роль, которую в этом могли бы иметь национальные правозащитные институты. Мой вопрос к панелистам созвучен уже прозвучавшим вопросом. Какие могут быть возможности для преодоления вызовов, связанных с нехваткой ресурсов? И как национальные правозащитные институты приоритизируют свою деятельность в условиях нехватки ресурсов? Как вы поддерживаете баланс между национальной и международной работой по продвижению прав коренных народов? Спасибо большое.
Thank you for your statements and the questions raised. I now give the floor to Crimean Tatar Resource Center.
Thank you, dear Chairman. I would like to draw your attention to the role of national and regional human rights institutions in the implementation of the declaration, using the example of Ukraine and Europe. Since 2014, Ukraine has taken important steps, adopted the law of indigenous peoples of Ukraine based on the principles of declaration, created state mechanism for developing policies to protect the rights of indigenous peoples. These changes have occurred due to the active participation of indigenous peoples organizations, the Mauritius of the Crimean Tatar people, human rights institution, the ombudsman of Ukraine, civil society. However, we are faced with challenges. The Cabinet of Ministers of Ukraine has been delaying the process of securing the legal status of the Mauritius of the Crimean Tatar people as a representative body of the indigenous people. The impossibility, the amending the constitution of Ukraine to guarantee the right to self-determination of the Crimean Tatar people due to Russia's military aggression. The lack of access to the territory of Crimea, where the rights of the indigenous people were systematically violated. The ban of Majlis, arrests, forced disappearances. I would like to note the role of regional human rights institutions. Thus, in 2023, the Commissioner for Human Rights of the Council of Europe prepared a separate report on the situation of the Crimean Tatar people. Thanks to the assistance of European Human Rights Institution, a new version of the law on national minorities was adopted in Ukraine, and articles were introduced into the law on education of Ukraine that provide guarantees of education in the native language of indigenous people. Recommendations to Ukraine to develop a national plan for the implementation of the declaration and complete the process of securing the legal status of the Mauritius of the Crimean Tatar people. To the OSCE, that develop an action plan to improve the situation of indigenous people in the OSCE area. To the UN, they develop a humanitarian response plan for indigenous peoples from the territories of the interstate conflict. Thank you for your attention.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to WIN Sports International.
Thank you very much. Respectful greetings to all delegations. This is a joint statement. Your Excellencies and esteemed members, we want to take this time to uplift, as a good practice, recent events in Treaty 6 territory. For example, the Indigenous Justice Symposium on Regaining Legal Sovereignty, as hosted by the Samson Cree Nation and the International Indigenous Resource Development. Secondly, the Alberta Court of Justice Access to Justice Through an Indigenous Lens Symposium and the Alberta Indigenous Justice Strategy. Thirdly, the Nipsicopak Treaty Police Framework and Nipsicopak Treaty Police Act as submitted at the 17th session of the expert mechanism under the theme of Article 38. These initiatives support the recognition and implementation of a treaty-based approach to policing, restorative justice, and traditional courts. We call on national and regional human rights institutions, including law foundations and societies, and the juridical systems to comply through the effective implementation of the UN Declaration Articles 3, 27, and 28 to advance and achieve redress, reparation, and reconciliation, and in cooperation, good faith, and in conjunction with indigenous peoples, tribes, and nations. Finally, we would recommend the creation of new legal space for the establishment of a Cree Nehel Treaty-based Human Rights Commission and a Treaty Commissioner to monitor and oversee the positive enforcement of Treaty Number 6 of 1876 and the 1877 adhesion thereto, in accordance with the UN and American Declarations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, Articles 37 and 24, respectively. We thank you very kindly through you, Mr. Chairman. Hai hai. Merci, nakumik, gracias, and thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I now give the floor to Argentina.
Gracias, señor presidente. En cumplimiento con nuestra Constitución y con la ley que nos rige como organismo nacional y adecuados a la Declaración sobre Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, quiero compartir con todos 3 buenas prácticas. En primer lugar, el Instituto Nacional de Asuntos Indígenas creó el Consejo Federal de Políticas Indígenas como un espacio de diálogo y colaboración entre el Gobierno Nacional y las provincias para implementar políticas a favor de los pueblos originarios. Este Consejo busca acordar acciones y programas que garanticen el cumplimiento de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas, respetando su identidad y cultura. La resolución número 6 del año 2024 constituye la Mesa Interministerial para los Pueblos Indígenas en el ámbito del Instituto Nacional de Asuntos Indígenas, que tendrá como objetivo el diagnóstico conjunto sobre la situación de las comunidades indígenas y la definición sobre las regiones prioritarias a abordar, la elaboración de iniciativas articuladas con el objetivo de promover sinergias y aprovechar los recursos existentes de manera eficiente, el establecimiento de articulaciones con los gobiernos provinciales, de modo de generar un espacio de consenso que posibilite efectivizar políticas dirigidas a las comunidades, el establecimiento de estrategias de vinculación con las comunidades para garantizar la participación de los pueblos indígenas en los temas que los convoquen. Tercero, la articulación con la OIT en el marco del Consejo Federal, con organismos de competencia en materia de pueblos indígenas con competencias locales, promoviendo espacios formativos a funcionarios públicos para la implementación y garantía del derecho a la consulta previa, libre e informado. Muchas gracias, señor presidente.
Thank you for your statements. I now give the floor to Congress Mondial Amazic.
Honorable assistance, Azul. Le Congrès mondial Amazigh salue cette initiative de débattre et discuter du rôle des institutions nationales et régionales des droits de l'homme dans la réalisation des objectifs de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Malgré le vote en faveur de la déclaration par les États d'Afrique du Nord, ni ces États, ni les INDH ne reconnaissent la qualité de peuple autochtone aux Amazighs d'Afrique du Nord, ce qui constitue une première violation de la dite déclaration et par conséquent tous les droits qui en découlent. La reconnaissance est en effet un préalable indispensable à la mise en œuvre et au respect plein et entier des droits des peuples autochtones et en particulier le droit à l'autodétermination et le droit au consentement libre et éclairé. En Algérie, par exemple, le Conseil national des droits de l'homme, CNDH, ne rend compte d'aucune des violations graves et répétées des droits et libertés des Amazighs et particulièrement du peuple kabyle. Même les condamnations à la peine de mort suite à des procès expéditifs et inéquitables ne font pas l'objet de l'attention de ce Conseil. Au motif de sa non-conformité avec les principes de Paris, le Conseil national des droits de l'homme algérien s'est vu réaccrédité au statut B par l'Alliance mondiale des institutions nationales des droits de l'homme. L'évolution liberticide de la législation algérienne, dénoncée par les instances internationales et les organisations de défense des droits de l'homme, comme par exemple l'article 87 bis du Code pénal, ne préoccupe aucunement l'INDH de ce pays. Cet article criminalise toute action pacifique et donne le droit aux autorités algériennes de violer les libertés d'expression et de manifestation. Il interdit en Algérie de dire « je suis amazigh » autochtones et de revendiquer mon droit à l'autodétermination. Des centaines d'Amazighs, dans une grande majorité kabyle, des jeunes, des femmes, des journalistes, des écrivains et des avocats sont harcelés par la justice algérienne et réprimés. Des mouvements pacifiques, comme le mouvement pour l'autodétermination de la Kabylie, sont considérés comme terroristes, donnant lieu à une véritable chasse à l'homme et des condamnations arbitraires. Le Conseil national des droits de l'homme algérien n'a produit aucune étude ni rapport relatif au recul des libertés, au racisme, aux discriminations et à la répression quasi systémique des Amazirs. En conséquence, il ne joue aucunement son rôle de vigile et de défenseur des droits. Ces déclarations consistent à reprendre les discours gouvernementaux. Le Congrès mondial Amazigh a sollicité le Conseil national des droits de l'homme algérien sur les droits des Amazirs, une demande restée sans suite. Le CMA considère qu'il est donc urgent que le Conseil national des droits de l'homme algérien soit conforme aux normes régissant les INDH et au droit international, en particulier en ce qui concerne la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Je vous remercie.
Thank you for your statements. I now give the floor to Public Organization of the Khanty-Mansiask Autonomous Okrug Югра.
Господин председатель, я представляю коренные народы Ханты-Мансийского автономного округа Югры, Ханты, Манси и Ненцы. Всего в нашем регионе проживает 32 тысячи представителей коренных малочисленных народов Севера. Это менее 1% населения региона. Хочу поздравить всех панелистов с достижениями в области правовой защиты. Поддержу выступление Григория Дюкарева. Долгое время коренные народы Югры внимательно следили за вкладом Института уполномоченного в Красноярском крае и его в доступ коренных народов к правосудию. Более 10 лет мы обсуждали в нашем регионе возможность создания такого института. Но нам не удавалось убедить органы власти. В прошлом году новый губернатор Югры поддержал нашу инициативу. Был принят закон, и буквально неделю назад парламент назначил первого омбудсмена. Им стала президент нашей общественной организации «Спасение Югры» Людмила Алферова. 5 кандидатов на эту должность предлагали непосредственно организации коренных народов. Мы возлагаем большие надежды на институт омбудсмена в защите наших прав, исправлении системных законодательных ошибок, поощрении прав коренных народов в целом на уровне региона, России и международных площадках. Григорий Дюкарев упомянул защиту прав коренных народов в контексте промышленной деятельности. Это еще одна критически важная тема для национальных правозащитных учреждений. С учетом рекомендаций Декларации ООН о правах коренных народов мы также считаем вкладом в доступ к правосудию Ассамблею представителей коренных малочисленных народов Севера в составе регионального парламента. Члены Ассамблеи – парламентарии из числа коренных народов. Участвуют в разработке законов, затрагивающих права и интересы коренных народов, и контролируют их исполнение. Один из членов Ассамблеи по закону – заместитель председателя парламента. Также при правительстве Югры образован Совет представителей коренных народов Севера. Члены Совета обсуждают законотворческие и практические вопросы до их утверждения. Также создана комиссия по вопросам территории традиционного природопользования. В случае наличия спорных вопросов при проектировании и размещении объектов на традиционных территориях комиссия принимает решение с учетом мнения представителя домохозяйства коренных народов. Рекомендуем экспертному механизму провести исследование о роли национальных правозащитных учреждений в достижении целей декларации. Также рекомендуем экспертному механизму коренных народов, используя свои полномочия, содействовать диалогу коренных народов, государств и частных компаний, продвигать необходимость создания независимых механизмов рассмотрения жалоб в рамках должной осмотрительности. Спасибо.
I thank you for your statement. In the interest of time, I would like to give the floor to one speaker and then turn the floor to the panelists who've been patiently and attentively listening to your comments and questions, for them also to respond to some of the questions and comments that you've given. So now I would like to give the floor to National Papua Verining, West New Guinea.
Oh yes, thanks. Yes. Yeah.
Yes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairperson and respected delegating. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here in the forum. I am attend this forum as a representative of the indigenous people of the eastern Indonesia, namely the province of Central Papua in the mountains region. In the particular, I represented the Papuan minority who have been politically opposite to the government. The conflict in the mountain region is still ongoing. And this is a matter of great concern to the Indonesian government. This politically motivated conflict has resulted in numerous consolidated amongst the indigenous Papuans people and non-Papuan residents. To address this political conflict and violence, I'm requesting the Indonesian government representative persons at this forum to facilitate political negotiation with the national government of West Papua, led by Simon Sapioper, and the National Liberation Army commanded by Puro Okimbawenda. Because the region led by Commander Puro Okimbawenda has unilateral declared the Lanijaya region in Central Papua in the mountain to be outside the geographic territory of the sovereign states of the Republic of Indonesia. And indigenous people of Lani have long recognized the national government of Republic of West Papua as the governing authority of the region. Therefore, I propose the following in this forum. I emphasize that we are willing to negotiate with Indonesian government, and we urge the representative of the Indonesian government to take this matter seriously and contact us. I thank you.
I thank you for your statement. I would like now to give back the floor to the panelists for concluding remarks and reactions to what they've heard in the room. Again, in the interest of time, you will have only 3 minutes, which, you know, might not be fair given what you've heard and the questions that have been raised, but I hope you would be able to give your concluding remarks in 3 minutes. The first, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Broderstam for your concluding remarks. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I will try to highlight or say something about the independence from GANHRI's side. Expert Lightfoot asked a question about how we can safeguard the independence as NHRIs, as GANHRI, and as states. So firstly, I need to underline that states have a responsibility to ensure and maintain or create environments that NHRI can operate independently and in line with the Paris Principles. That is very important. And then there is this Paris Principles endorsed by the UN General Assembly in 1993. And one of the most important criteria here is formal and functional independence. And this is the international benchmark for the establishment and operation of independent NHRIs. Beyond the Paris Principles, NHRIs can safeguard their independence from government through combination of legal, financial, structural, and operational measures. This includes enshrining their mandate and autonomy in the Constitution or a higher legal frameworks, securing budget allocations directly from Parliament, and ensuring transparent, merit-based, and pluralistic appointment processes. NHRI should have the freedom to set their priorities, access information and communities without restrictions, and publish reports without government approval. Accountability should be to the public, not executive, and legal protection must shield staff from retaliation. And also, I would like to say that engaging with international and regional mechanism like GANHRI, EMRIP, and fostering a strong internal culture of integrity further reinforce their ability to act independently, particularly in defending the rights of indigenous peoples. I have a bit time left. I would also just highlight that that NHRI's grounding in national frameworks play also a vital role when we are trying to apply UNDRIP in ways that are responsive and their specific legal and in their specific legal and political systems, while try to support the broader objective of advancing the rights of indigenous peoples. Yeah, I can stop here. Thank you.
Thank you for those concluding remarks. I now give the floor to Madame Buba for your concluding remarks.
Thank you, Chair.
I would also want to respond to Cheryl on her questions of independence of the institution when we are funded by government. It's true that the independence is guaranteed by the law that created the institution, but practically the institutions can have limitations. We can have obstructions in performing our duties. We have had such obstructions before the institution was reformed in 2019. Around 2018, we were going through a lot of crises. We had insurgencies from secessionists in 2 regions of our country, and we also have attacks from terrorists coming from Nigeria, attacking the country in the far north of our country. And there were many secessionists who were arrested in Nigeria and brought back to Cameroon, and we tried to use our mandate, our protection mandate, to visit them, to verify their conditions of detention, but we did everything and we were refused access to these detainees or alleged secessionists. So we couldn't visit them for a long time until they were finally incarcerated in prisons. That is the only, after 2021, that we could visit them. We visited them several times and we could discuss with them. With the reform of the institution, the powers of the institution were reinforced by giving us access to detention places without prior notice or even without being accompanied by the prosecutor. So, and also enlarging in the places of detention to other places, to several other places which are not traditional places of detention. So at least the powers of the institutions have been strengthened, and then politicians were removed because we had, our commission was very, very plethoric. The number of members were plethoric. We were 30, and then it was reduced to half, and the politicians were removed because those politicians were the people who were obstructing the work of the commission. They will always report. Anytime we want to do some work, they have already called their people to report that this is what the commission is planning to do. So this also helped us. And then the budget of the commission is in the budget of the government. It is a line in the budget of the government presented by the Prime Minister of the country before the Parliament for adoption. It's true that the budget has been increased by 300%. Even though it's still not enough because we have 10 regional bodies and 1 divisional body. So it has increased, and personnel also, we have also increased. The personnel is higher. So the budget is still limited. We also adopted strategies how we could also go around some of these obstacles. So we have partnership with the Parliament. It is also a recommendation by the one of the principles, I think, the Belgrade principles, to recommend that national human rights institutions should cooperate and collaborate with the Parliament. So we are collaborating with the Parliament, and through the Parliament, we can also lobby that they should plead for our budget to be increased. We also work with the government. We work with the government. We can always meet the government. We can meet the Prime Minister. And we also have a strategy that towards the end of the year, we ask for an increase of our budget. We try to show them that the budget we have exhausted our budget, and we have still activities to do. So the government gives us an addition to our budget every year, and that permits us to carry out several activities through the end of the year and even early the year that follows. So those are the ways that we have. We have also done a lot of sensitization on the institution because the institution was not known. Before, the government agencies thought that we are an NGO. But since 2021, we have at least put the point clear for the government to know we are not an NGO, we are an institution. We are a public institution, independent public. So right now, they respect us, they know who we are, and they are ready to collaborate. So that's how we have gone around the problem. Thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for the statement and apologies for the interruption. I now give the floor to Mr. Deyukarev for your concluding remarks. You have 3 minutes.
Спасибо, господин председатель. Я благодарю всех выступавших за активную позицию в продвижении национальных правозащитных учреждений. Хочу поблагодарить доктора Лайтфуд и госпожу Горбунову за те вопросы, которые вы нам задали. Они действительно важны. Вы спрашивали, как мы отслеживаем исполнение наших рекомендаций, которые мы делаем в адрес органов государственной власти, губернаторов, депутатов парламента. Во-первых, рекомендации содержатся в моем ежегодном докладе по каждому блоку в тех аспектах, которые касаются коренных народов. Парламент наш региональный парламент Красноярского края их рассматривает и принимает постановление, которое обязательно к исполнению для всех министерств, для агентств, если их это непосредственно касается. Кроме того, ежегодно в конце года я запрашиваю у министерств и агентств информацию, как они работали с моими рекомендациями. Конечно, бывают случаи, когда рекомендации по тем или иным причинам игнорируются. Но в этом случае мы обращаемся к поддержке в том числе и губернатора нашего, и председателя правительства, чтобы они в очередной раз акцентировали эту проблематику. В части ресурсного обеспечения наш институт обеспечивает ресурсами наш парламент. Это коллегиальный орган, это депутаты. Они ежегодно утверждают бюджет, выделяют финансовые средства, которые позволяют мне выезжать в места традиционного проживания коренных народов, опубликовывать мои доклады, осуществлять иную правозащитную деятельность. Кроме того, в целях содействия у меня есть на местах общественные представители уполномоченного. Как правило, это либо старейшины, либо люди с активной жизненной позицией. Они мне предоставляют информацию непосредственно с мест, где что-то происходит, и весьма оперативно. Иногда поступает сообщение ночью, и мы вынуждены просыпаться и реагировать на те или иные нарушения. Кроме того, хотел бы отметить то, что мы активно взаимодействуем с Институтом уполномоченного по правам человека и на страновом уровне с госпожой Москальковой, и на региональных уровнях. Мы ежегодно несколько раз в год выезжаем и принимаем участие в работе Координационного совета уполномоченных по правам человека. И кроме того, взаимодействуем с уполномоченным по правам ребенка, с уполномоченным по правам предпринимателей и других социальных групп. Спасибо.
Thank you for your concluding statement. I now give the floor to Ms. Waipoti for your concluding statement. You have 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge all the stories, the ancestors in making, and Indigenous peoples in this room who have shared today, in strength, struggle, and continuing existence that thread us all together as Indigenous peoples. The details of struggle may look different in different places, but it's the same struggle against colonialism and racism and our right to just exist. It can manifest as structural racism or as Indigenous peoples dying early from preventable causes, overt rejection of Indigenous rights and international frameworks from governments of the day, and we know with the genocide occurring in the world right now that overt colonial violence is explicit attempts to eradicate Indigenous peoples. But we are not going anywhere. We are creative, we are strong, we are loving, and we are. Our lands remember us, our rivers remember us, even when we are displaced. There is collective strength here, even in our collective struggle. Ngā mihi nui kia koutou, kia tātou. In relation to your question, Pātai Dr. Lightfoot, the question on how we as a national human rights institution at New Zealand monitor impact in upholding our human rights and Indigenous rights, one of the ways we do that as the New Zealand Human Rights Commission is measured by the experience of our Indigenous peoples. An approach to reaffirm nation-to-nation relationships envisioned under Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. We do this by asking them of their experience on our work, and that is one of the core measures for us. Our role as New Zealand's Human Rights Commission is to support the implementation of human rights standards domestically. Our focus is on our leaders realising the potential of human rights and Indigenous rights to lead to better outcomes for everyone. It is concerning to sit here before you today knowing that comments coming from our government at this moment in time appear to be undermining the framework of the United Nations. Therefore, the Commission requests again that the EMRIP not be deterred by the New Zealand Government's lack of response to proceed with a follow-up visit. It is needed more so than ever. We will continue to urge and support the government to cooperate fully with the EMRIP's follow-up country visit, because urgent action is needed to protect human rights in Te Tiriti o Waitangi and New Zealand's constitutional framework. Human rights and obligations under the treaty, under Te Tiriti and UNDRIP do not yield depending on the government of a day, but greater constitutional protection is needed. We welcome today's focus on strengthening collaboration. As Indigenous people, we can be hopeful. We can draw on the continued strength of our Indigenous brothers and sisters. We have the right to our culture, to our language and to our lands. We always have and always will be the right to our indigeneity and our sovereignty. Until we all have that right, we are not free. Nā reira, kia whakakotahi te whatumanoa, kia mahia ngāhiri, kia tū rangatira ai, mauri ora tēnā koutou.
Thank you for your concluding statement. And I think we would like to thank all the panelists for the contributions and good practices, but also the challenges you've raised. I think the session has benefited from your expertise, knowledge, and experiences, but also to all of you for the questions that you've raised, the comments, and also your respective experiences that you've shared. So without any further ado, I think we now bring this session to close. And we wish you very good and, bon appetit lunchtime. Thank you.
Teman-teman, terima kasih banyak telah menyaksikan siaran di channel YouTube Manuskrip Papua. Kami sangat menghargai setiap dukungan yang kalian berikan. Tanpa kalian, perjalanan channel ini tidak akan terasa seistimewa ini. Salam dan hormat dari YouTuber Manuskrip Papua.
Manuskrip Papua.